Episode 41, Part 14, Chapter 39. Chapter 39. The hours following the death of Hojo were a blur for most of the companions, with memories of a long night they did not want to remember. Reeve had been waiting for them when they reached the bottom of the canyon. On his request, Cloud and the others split up into the city to help with the evacuation, aiding the emergency services to evacuate as many children or injured civilians as possible. Reeve, they learned, was in charge of the operation, which he had implemented as soon as Scarlet and Heidegger had been retired. And so the companions had teamed up in pairs and dispersed into the city. The raging storm impeded the effort, making it difficult for the emergency helicopters to land. Some civilians, to their surprise, helped out by aiding the young, old, and injured to the helicopters. They worked well into the night. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, the storm passed. Reeve thanked the companions for their help. They had managed to evacuate almost a fifth of the city's inhabitants in a single night. Now that the civilians knew that help was on the way, they were beginning to calm down, and as such Reeve said that he could handle the rest. The companions said their goodbyes to Reeve, wished him luck, and returned to the Highwind. The crew welcomed them back with cheers and applause, but the companions were too tired to respond. The long night had taken its toll on their bruised, tired bodies. They crawled into their beds, or in Red 13's case, the floor on the bridge, and let welcome sleep take them.
Shinra's finished,
said Kat. It was now the following morning, and the companions were once again gathered on the bridge of the Highwind. They all looked tired. Their sleep had been far from peaceful. Visions of misshapen monsters had haunted their dreams. It was only when none of them would admit this they dreamt of a warm hand touching their shoulder, or a glimpse of a brown-haired figure with a pink ribbon, that their dreams finally eased and they were able to sleep once again. Cloud turned away from the window.
Meteor's going to fall in about.
He frowned, thinking. When was Meteor going to fall? Red 13 answered his question.
7 more days,
he said. He looked at the floor and shook his head.
That's what grandfather said.
Cloud crossed his arms and looked closely at Red 13. His stare was so intense and thoughtful that Red 13 felt almost embarrassed and shuffled from paw to paw. His tail, sensing his anxiety, twitched along the floor.
Red 13,
said Cloud finally.
You want to see everyone in Cosmo Canyon again?
The hound stopped shuffling and looked at Cloud.
Yes,
he answered, quiet. Cloud nodded. He had thought as much. Red 13's thoughts were never far from his grandfather, or his home in Cosmo Canyon. And he was not the only one. Cloud turned to Barrett.
You want to see Marlene, right?
He asked. Now it was Barrett's turn to shift uncomfortably.
Don't ask me that,
he said snippily. The answer, of course, was obvious. Cloud then turned his attention to the whole group.
We'll beat Sephiroth,
he said, and his voice had a serious tone to it.
Then, if we don't release the power of Holy in 7 days, there won't be a planet left to protect. If we can't beat Sephiroth, it's as good as death for us. We'll just go a few days sooner than the rest who'll die from Meteor.
Barrett couldn't believe his ears.
Don't be thinking you're gonna lose before you even fight,
he shouted, startling Yuffie, who still had a headache from the night before. Cloud quickly turned to him and shook his head fiercely, indicating that that was not what he meant.
No,
he said sharply. He paused and turned to face the window. Raindrops still dotted the glass from the night's heavy rain, and the murky gray sky promised more rain to come. Cloud watched as a trickle of water slid along the glass, trying to think of the right words to use to express what it was he wanted to say.
What I meant was,
Cloud said, starting again.
What are we all fighting for? I want us all to understand that.
The swordsman leaned his arm against the window.
Save the planet. For the future of the planet. Sure, that's all fine. But really, is that how it is?
Cloud's eyes wandered down to the ground, where the dry and parched land was finally soaking up much-needed water. It reminded him of another rainy day not so long ago. He turned from the window.
For me, this is a personal feud. I want to beat Sephiroth and settle my past. Saving the planet just happens to be part of that. I've been thinking. I think we all are fighting for ourselves. For ourselves. And that someone, something, whatever that is, that's important to us. That's what we're fighting for. That's why we keep up this battle for the planet.
Barrett listened to Cloud's words with a serious face. Then he nodded slowly.
You're right,
he admitted, though it was with much regret.
It sounds cool saying it's to save the planet. But I was the one who blew up that Mako reactor.
He scratched his head sheepishly, aware of Kat's eyes on him.
Looking back now, I can see that wasn't the right way to do things. I made a lot of friends and innocent bystanders suffer. At first, it was revenge against Shinra. For attacking my town. But now... yeah. I'm fighting for Marlene. For Marlene. For Marlene's future. Yeah. I guess I just want to save the planet for Marlene's sake.
Cloud nodded his head. He smiled. It seemed Barrett understood. It was not about saving the planet. It was about protecting what was important to them. They fought because they had something that they wanted to protect. At all costs. Saving the planet and the rest of the people won it. Was just a bonus. Around him, the others were beginning to realize this too. Each of them began to think of the things that were most important to them. Whether they were personal memories, people, or even dreams that they had for the future. In their hearts they gauged the importance of all these things, trying to decide if they were something truly worth risking their lives for.
Go and see her,
Cloud told Barrett.
Make sure you're right, and come back.
He then looked to everyone else.
All of you. Get off the ship and find out your reasons for yourselves. I want you to make sure. Then I want you to come back. Maybe ain't none of us'll come back,
Sid pointed out. Everyone looked at him.
Meteor's gonna kill us all anyway. Let's just forget any useless struggling.
It was a blunt statement. Nonetheless, it was true. What Cloud was asking had huge implications. With the northern barrier gone, their next opponent would be Sephiroth himself. Fighting Hojo had been difficult, but Sephiroth would be much stronger. If they didn't have the heart to fight him, Cloud was saying, then they should not go.
I know why I'm fighting,
Cloud said.
I'm fighting to save the planet, and that's that. But besides that, there's something personal too. A very personal memory that I have.
Once more, he looked around at his friends.
What about you all? I want all of you to find that something within yourselves. If you don't find it, then that's okay too. You can't fight without a reason, right? So, I won't hold it against you if you don't come back.
His speech over, the Highwind turned and headed off, taking everyone home. They dropped Barrett off first just outside of Midgar, after Kat finally revealed to him where Marlene was staying and eagerly waiting for him. The big man ran off, longing to see the little girl he had not seen in so long. The next stop was Cosmo Canyon. As always, they landed the airship on the outskirts of the Rocky Mountains and let Red 13 jump from the ship. The Hound ran towards the village with great enthusiasm. His grandfather should have returned to the village by now, and Red 13 was eager to see him again. Vincent they dropped off in Nibelheim, the only place that held any meaning for him. Here was where he had met Lucretia for the first time, and the place where his life had been changed forever. The Shinra staff living there had packed their bags and left, leaving Nibelheim as nothing more than a ghost town built in a shadow of memory. The gunman walked through the silent streets and headed towards Shinra Mansion. He walked through its giant doors and closed them behind him. Sid was next. The Highwind landed just outside of Rocket Town, startling more than a few of the residents who had dared to step outside and into Meteor's light. The pilot said nothing as he left the ship, nor did he look at anyone. He climbed silently down the ladder and headed towards the town. Instead of heading towards his house, however, he went to the now empty launch pad. The Shinra number 26 was gone now, but it was still his favorite place to be. The pilot wandered among the remains, before sitting down amongst them. He lit up a cigarette, thinking hard. The Highwind then crossed the ocean and stopped outside of Wutai, Yuffie's home. The ninja was uncharacteristically somber as she descended from the Highwind. The enormity of what Cloud was asking of them had finally sunk in, it seemed. Yuffie, more than anyone, had little reason to fight. She had wormed her way into the group only for the opportunity to get more materia for her village, not to end up in a battle for the planet. It was a big step, and required a lot of serious thinking for the 16-year-old girl. The last to leave the airship was Kat, albeit a little unconventionally. Being nothing more than a remote-controlled robot, there was no special place for Kat to go. So he said a brief farewell to Cloud before taking his place at the back of the bridge. He gave them a quick wave and then deactivated himself, slumping against the wall. Back in Midgar, Reeve wandered the streets of Midgar, lost in thought. The high wind returned to the lands outside Midgar, the agreed meeting place for those who decided to return. Here the airship crew left, for even their job was not without danger. That left only Cloud and Tifa. They stood together on the bridge of the high wind, looking at each other.
What are you going to do, Tifa?
Cloud asked her. Tifa looked at him, her dark eyes saddened.
Did you forget?
She asked in reply.
I'm all alone. I don't have anywhere to go.
Some time later, when the day was drawing to a close and the sun was beginning to set in the west, the high wind came to a rest on the outskirts of the Midgar plains. Without their friends, they found the high wind was too lonely a place to stay, so they turned off all the power and left the airship behind. They stood together at the top of a rocky hill, watching the sunset. Tifa walked to the edge of a rocky ledge and looked up at the sky. The rain clouds had finally cleared, and it promised to be a beautifully clear and peaceful night. It was the end of another day. Tomorrow would be the day they went to the northern cave to challenge Sephiroth. The chosen day. This, Tifa realized, could be the last sunset she might ever see. The last night she'd get to spend with her friends, who, at that moment, were probably thinking these very same things.
Everyone's gone,
she whispered sadly, breaking the silence. Cloud nodded his head slowly and watched as a thin, grey cloud drifted overhead the last remnants of the storm.
Yeah,
he replied.
We don't have anywhere or anyone to go home to.
Tifa lowered her head and stared at the ground. Aside from each other, everybody they had loved and held dear were already dead. Her father, Cloud's mother, their friends. Even their hometown no longer felt like their own. The Shinra company had deprived them even of a place to call home. Find your reason to fight. That was what Cloud wanted them to do. Find something that they treasured so much that they would fight to the death for it. Yet what reason was there to fight, when so much had already been taken away? She knew her answer, of course. It had come to her the moment Cloud had asked her. Her reason to fight was her friends. Cloud, Barrett, and the others. She wanted to keep on fighting for their sakes. To be able to see them every day, speak with them every day. Just to be with them. Tifa wanted to fight so that she could continue doing that, each and every day. That was her reason.
You're right,
she said. The fighter ran a hand through her long dark brown hair, freshly washed and combed following the hectic night.
But I'm sure someday they'll come back, don't you think?
She was talking about the others. Even though some of them, such as Sid, had seemed hesitant about splitting up to find their reason for fighting, Tifa knew deep inside that they would find it. She knew in her heart that they would come back. Cloud, however, did not seem as sure.
I wonder,
he said.
Everyone has an irreplaceable something they're holding onto. But this time, our opponent,
Sephiroth. Tifa turned to Cloud.
But that's all right, even if no one comes back.
Cloud raised his head to look at her. Tifa smiled at him.
As long as I'm with you,
she said.
As long as you're by my side, I won't give up even if I'm scared. Tifa.
Tifa clasped her hands behind her back.
No matter how close we are, we were far apart before this.
She looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to slip behind the mountains.
But when we were in the live stream surrounded by all those screams of anguish, I thought I heard your voice.
A cool wind blew and ruffled her dark hair. Tifa closed her eyes, letting the rain blow across her skin and ruffle her clothes. She listened as it rustled through the patchy grass. Up here the world was so different, no one would ever guess the pain and suffering of the planet deep inside. But Tifa had never forgotten those feelings, the horrid cries of a planet in desperate pain. Tifa thought she would lose herself that day, drowning in the misery of the planet. Tears welled up in her eyes.
You probably don't remember this,
she said with a sniffle.
But deep in my heart I heard you calling my name. Or at least I thought you did. I see,
he said, turning away.
I think I've heard about it, too.
He tried to cast his mind back to when he too was in the live stream. But as Tifa had said, there was much he could not remember. His memories of what happened after he fell into the live stream at the northern crater were fuzzy, most of it felt like a strange dream. Yet there was one thing he did remember clearly, the sound of a voice calling his name.
At that time, it was Tifa's voice.
Cloud trailed off. He turned to Tifa, who still had her back to him.
You were calling me back from the stream of consciousness in the life stream. After all, I promised that if anything were to ever happen to you, I would come to help.
Tifa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked up at the sky, where the evening stars were just becoming visible. Tifa's tears slowly stopped as she looked up at those stars. She would not tell anybody this, but many nights she stayed up to watch the stars while the others were sleeping. She found the same solace looking up at the stars that Sid did, although for entirely different reasons. When Sid looked at the stars, he saw the vast expanse of space and ocean filled with unknowns. When Tifa looked at them, it made her think more about where she was now. There were less and less stars shining, lately drowned out by meteors' light.
Cloud? Do you think the stars can hear us? Do you think they can see how hard we're fighting for them?
Cloud followed her gaze, his eyes traced a pattern through a small cluster of stars.
I dunno.
He answered her finally.
But whether they are or not, we still have to do what we can. And believe in ourselves. Right, Tifa? I'll find the answer someday. As long as I keep trying. That's what I learned from you when I was in the live stream.
Tifa tore her eyes away from the stars and looked back at the ground.
Yeah. That's right.
She said softly. Another tear rolled down her cheek. Cloud too looked away from the stars, and turned his eyes to Tifa.
Hey Tifa.
He then stopped, hesitant. In front of him, Tifa inclined her head, waiting for him to speak. It had been a long time since he and Tifa had been alone together like this. Not since the live stream, in fact. Events had moved so fast there had been little time to reflect on the experiences they had shared, or to say things that still needed to be said. Now that they were alone, they had that chance. Cloud scratched the back of his head, feeling suddenly awkward. He tried again.
There's a lot of things I wanted to talk to you about,
he said, trying a different approach.
But now that we're together like this, I don't know what I really wanted to say.
He sighed.
I guess nothing's changed at all. Kind of makes you want to laugh.
To prove his point, he chuckled softly. Tifa, however, did not laugh. She turned to face Cloud, her dark eyes gleaming with tears.
Cloud. Words aren't the only thing that tell people what you're thinking.
She paused, waiting for Cloud to continue. She looked right into his glowing blue eyes and held their gaze in earnest. She knew he was troubled by the thoughts of what may happen tomorrow, and that he was keeping those thoughts locked up tight. How she longed for him to open up to her and tell her what he was thinking and feeling, to give her a chance to relieve that worry. But Cloud, unfortunately, just turned his gaze away from her.
We've got a big battle tomorrow,
he said instead.
We had better get some sleep.
Tifa waited a moment, hoping that he would say something more to give away what he was feeling. But Cloud refused to look at her, he was not quite ready to show the things he was keeping secret in his heart. Accepting this, Tifa slowly nodded her head. This was another reason she chose to fight alongside him. So that when Cloud was ready, she would be there for him. For now, at least, she had to wait.
Yes, I guess you're right.
She said. Tifa's dreams that night were peaceful and filled with memories, as she slept beneath the stars at Cloud's side. They sat together on the rocky hill, with Tifa's head resting on Cloud's shoulder. There were no dreams of terrifying monsters promising death. All those nightmares had been pushed aside, her subconscious knowing no matter what she had Cloud by her side to protect her. Cloud, however, did not sleep. The swordsman stayed awake throughout the night, watching Meteor as it drew ever closer to the planet. 7 days. That was all the planet had left before Meteor struck. No, it was less than that now. But if they could not defeat Sephiroth today, then this would be the last day they ever saw. His thoughts turned to his friends. How many of them would actually come back, he thought to himself. Tifa, he knew, was sure they would all come back. On the face of it the answer was obvious, of course they would come back and fight. But as Sid had pointed out yesterday, even if they did beat Sephiroth, there was always a chance that Meteor would destroy them anyway, so why struggle against a hopeless fate? These thoughts ran through Cloud's mind all night long, until the first light of dawn rose in the east. Seeing the growing light, Cloud looked over at Tifa. The fighter was still sleeping, her hair draped over her face.
It's almost dawn.
he said quietly. At his voice, Tifa stirred and opened her eyes.
Hey.
She muttered sleepily.
Morning, Tifa. Sorry. Did I wake you? It's almost dawn.
Tifa yawned and sat up.
Good morning, Cloud,
she said. She rubbed her eyes and looked up at the approaching dawn. She frowned. Had night passed already? She wasn't ready yet.
Give me a little longer,
she asked Cloud. She laid her head back against his shoulder, shuffling clothes.
Just a little longer. This day will never come again. So let me have this moment.
She closed her eyes again. Cloud looked down at her, silent. He looked up at the sky. It would still be another hour or so before the dawn had fully settled over the sky. They still had some time.
Yeah. Okay,
he answered.
This is probably the last time we'll have together.
But Tifa did not hear him. She had already fallen back asleep, returning to whatever dream she had been having before he had woken her up. Cloud smiled a little as he watched her sleeping. He then sighed heavily, laid his head against hers and closed his eyes. Perhaps even he could get a little sleep before morning came. Morning eventually came and Cloud, who had been unable to sleep after all, woke Tifa from her sleep. The young woman said little as Cloud went off to fetch water from a nearby lake, or when they ate breakfast. Her eyes kept drifting off to the land around them. Cloud knew what she was looking for, some sign that the others had returned. Cloud could have told her that she was wasting her time, he had not seen any sign of the others. Once breakfast was finished and cleared up, Cloud and Tifa sat on the hill and waited. Before the companions parted, it had been agreed that all those who decided to fight would return to the airship by 1 o'clock. After that the High Wind would leave and head on to the northern crater. The hours passed and the sun climbed higher and higher into the sky. It reached its zenith only 1 hour to go until the appointed time. Once again Tifa stood up and looked around at the landscape. There was still no sign of Barrett or the others. She folded her hands over her heart. Behind her, Cloud rose to his feet. He turned to her.
We had better go.
Tifa spun around to face him.
But, I still...
Her mind whirled. It was not yet the agreed time. Besides, there were still so many things that she wanted to say to him. It couldn't possibly be time to leave. Cloud shook his head, silencing any objections she might have raised.
It's all right, Tifa,
he told her.
You said so yourself yesterday. At least, we don't have to go on alone.
Tifa's heart was torn. She did not want to leave like this. And yet she knew. If the others had decided to come with them, they would have arrived long before now. But it was she herself who said that it did not matter if the others did not come back. As long as she was fighting by Cloud's side, then she would give her all.
Yes,
she said.
That's right.
She smiled. Cloud was glad to see the spark back in her eyes again. He bent down to pick his sword up from the ground and hooked it in its usual place behind his back.
Okay. Let's go,
he said, and headed back towards the airship. Tifa followed close behind. The High Wind was just as they had left it, empty and silent. Their footsteps echoed noisily on the metal hallways. It was as though all the life in the airship had gone. In a manner of speaking it had done, since Cloud and Tifa were the only living people on the High Wind. They began to cross the metal walkway leading to the main deck.
The airship is just too big for just the two of us,
Tifa said as they crossed, their boots clattering loudly. She looked around her. Normally, the sound of the engines would be almost deafening in her, but everything remained silent.
Yeah, it's a little lonely without everyone.
Cloud stopped and turned to her.
Don't worry. It'll be okay.
When Tifa looked at him incredulously, the swordsman grinned and dropped down to do a few energetic squats.
I'll make a big enough ruckus for everyone. Besides, I'm the pilot,
he added, finishing his squats.
No more flying around casually like before. We won't have time to feel lonely.
Tifa knew he was only trying to cheer her up, but she couldn't help but smile. She was just about to speak when the airship suddenly sprang into life. The engines roared as they came back online, lights flickered on throughout the airship. The walkway hummed and the familiar scent of working machinery filled the air. Cloud and Tifa looked around them in amazement.
Hey! It's moving,
said Cloud. He looked at Tifa. She looked back at him. The same thought crossed their minds. They turned and raced along the walkway, leaped up the steps to the door, flung it open and burst onto the bridge. Tifa jumped and cried out in joy. Barrett was there, along with Sid. Both men had their backs to Cloud and Tifa, with Sid working to bring the airship back online. Cloud stared in amazement.
Barrett. Sid.
Barrett turned. Seeing Cloud and Tifa, he scratched his head sheepishly.
Oh,
he said.
Is that okay with you?
Cloud nodded his head. Of course it was all right. After all, they had come back. Even Sid, who had been the one to raise doubts about them coming back in the first place. The pilot met his gaze and inclined his head, then turned back to the controls. A gruff bark sounded off to the right. Cloud and Tifa turned and jumped for joy as they saw Red 13 sitting at the bottom of the steps. The hound padded up the steps and sat at the top, his tail swishing.
Red 13!
exclaimed Cloud. Red 13 smiled. Tifa shook her head in disbelief. Barrett, Sid, and Red 13. They had come back. But when had they? She shook her head again and turned to Barrett.
Why didn't you tell me?
She demanded, her eyes accusing. Barrett shuffled uncomfortably. He scratched his head, unable to meet her gaze. Red 13 shook his head and looked over at Sid.
But, you know, Sid,
he said.
Hey, Red 13,
Sid interrupted. He left the controls and walked over to him.
If you butt in now, you never know what they'll say later.
Tifa watched the exchange in growing confusion. What on earth were they talking about? Barrett was still avoiding meeting her gaze, as was Red 13. Sid, however, grinned at her playfully. Suddenly she understood.
Were you watching?
She asked, a hot blush rising to her cheeks. Sid's teasing grin grew wider. Tifa's face burned hotter, and she turned and ran to the front of the airship. She stood with her back to Sid and the others, hands folded behind her back, and her foot tapping the floor shyly. Sid laughed at her embarrassment. Cloud sighed heavily. He heard the door open behind him and turned to see Vincent walk onto the bridge, cool as always. Cloud stared in amazement.
Vincent?
Vincent stopped and looked at Cloud.
Why such a puzzled look?
He asked.
You don't want me to come?
Cloud shook his head.
No,
he replied hurriedly,
it's just that you're always so cold. I thought you didn't care what was happening.
Cool. Vincent mulled this over.
I guess that's just how I am, sorry.
With that Vincent turned and jumped over the rails to the lower level, taking up his usual position. It had not been a hard decision to make. Though Hojo was gone, Vincent still had one more job to do. Lucretia's dreams of Sephiroth. He would help to put an end to them. The sound of static filled the room. Everyone turned to the back of the room, where Cat She had just come back online.
Well, looky here,
said Barrett, as Cat repositioned himself on the Mog's head.
The Shinra manager's come back.
Ignoring Barrett, Cat tapped the Mog on the head. The Mog too came back online and lifted its large body off the floor. It made a show of stretching itself, like it had just woken up from a long sleep, before turning and plodding over to rejoin Cloud and the others. Cat lowered his head and his ears drooped low.
Excuse me, but...
he began, a little hesitantly.
I wanted to come with the main group, but I couldn't get away. So some people in Midgar took me in.
The cat raised his head and looked at them in earnest.
I know I have a stuffed animal body, but I'll work really hard.
He looked at Cloud, his furry face hopeful. Cloud, in response, nodded his head. Midgar was in a terrible state, and with all the panic and the evacuation operations it would have been very difficult for Reeve to leave. But his robotic avatar was here in his place, and that was all that mattered. Barrett looked around, counting.
I guess that's everyone,
he said, folding his arms. Red 13 shook his head.
No, Yuffie's missing.
Barrett snorted.
She ain't gonna show up,
he said, scowling.
Least this time she didn't steal our materia. Guess we gotta be thankful for that. How could you say that?
The voice came from above. Barrett looked up and then jumped back in surprise as Yuffie jumped down through a hatch in the roof, which she had picked open to make a grand entrance. She landed in the center and spun round to face him, her face angry. The ninja put her hands on her hips and glared at Barrett indignantly.
I came all the way here after being seasick as a dog,
she said, huffing.
I didn't go through all that just to have you guys have all the best parts all to yourselves.
Her eyes looked like they could shoot daggers. Barrett scratched his head, sheepish. Yuffie turned her gaze round to everyone, daring them to oppose her being there. Cloud stepped forward.
Welcome back, Yuffie,
he said. Yuffie turned to face him. Her anger quickly dissipated, and her face took on a bashful expression.
Gee, Cloud,
she said, touched.
That's so nice of you to say that. You sick?
She laughed as Cloud scowled.
Well, whatever,
the ninja continued, turning away from him.
I'm gonna be in my reserved spot in the hall. Waiting.
Her face then paled as the engines gave an especially loud hum and caused the ground to vibrate beneath her.
Up. Irk.
She pushed past Cloud, her hands over her mouth, making a break for the hallway. Everyone watched her go. Cloud looked around at his friends. He had his doubts, but inwardly he was pleased that every single one of them had decided to fight. After everything they had been through together, it only made sense that they should face the end together, as well.
Thanks, everyone,
he said. Barrett's eyes narrowed.
We didn't come back for your spiky-headed ass,
he said, perhaps a little too hurriedly. He did not want Cloud to get the wrong idea.
We came back for Marlene. Guess it's just my whatcha-call, feelings or something.
Everybody's eyes were on him at this point, and he hesitated, feeling suddenly awkward. He turned away.
I ain't got no words now.
But words were no longer necessary. Everybody knew now why they were fighting. There were no more misguided feelings, no misconceptions. They each had found that special something they were fighting to save, whether it was a person, a place, or a memory. They had each found it, and would now give their life to protect it. Red 13 sat back on his haunches.
Although she's not here,
he said,
she left us a window of opportunity.
He lowered his head in memory.
We can't let it go like this,
said Sid. Cloud closed his eyes. In his mind's eye he could see her smiling face, and her eyes that were filled with laughter.
Eris,
he said.
She was smiling to the end. We have to do something, or that smile will freeze like that. Let's all go together. Memories of Eris. Although she should have returned to the planet by now, something stopped her and now she's stuck.
Cloud opened his eyes and looked round at his friends.
We have to let go of Eris's memory. Has anyone here changed their mind?
Sid asked, looking round. One by one the others shook their heads. No, they had not changed their minds. Cloud turned to him.
I'm counting on you, Sid. Yeah.
The pilot shrugged his shoulders and wandered back over to the wheel.
There are two levers that been bugging me for a while now,
he said. He gestured to the two levers, positioned beside the wheel.
Let me try them out.
Sid took hold of the two levers. The pilot then paused and turned to Cloud.
Alright, so what should I do? You decide, Cloud.
Now everyone's eyes turned to Cloud, awaiting his decision. Their faces were eager and ready. Each and every one of them was ready to go. Whether their journey led them to victory or death, they would give it their all. This was finally it.
This is our last battle,
Cloud told them.
Our target is the North Cave. Our enemy is Sephiroth. So let's move out.
On Cloud's command Sid pushed the two levers all the way to the top. Almost instantaneously the high wind gave a sudden, strong jolt, throwing everyone forward. Outside, the high wind began to change. Hatches opened up along the back and sides of the airship. Powerful Mako-powered jet engines emerged from inside. They hummed and then roared into life. The strong cables along the back of the airship disengaged and fell away. The high wind's propellers, now obsolete, fell away along with them, tumbling down towards the ground. Once the airship's transformation was complete, Sid released the brakes. All at once the airship plowed forward, moving at such great speed that it knocked nearly everybody on board off their feet. It took a few minutes for the companions to properly adjust to the high wind's increased speed. In Sid's hands the wheel rattled vigorously as the airship shook around them, but they were not worried. The high wind was a powerful airship, it would take more than a bit of shaking to break it apart. They made excellent progress. It took them no more than a few minutes to reach the shore, and they set out across the ocean. Not long after that, the southernmost shores of the northern continent came into view, along with the rugged peaks that covered the land. Cloud and his friends watched from the bridge as the land rushed in at them and then underneath them, as the high wind soared over the mountains toward the northern crater.
"We're almost at the North Cave," said
Cloud. Up ahead of them, in the distance, he could just about see the northern crater rising above the jagged mountain peaks. The swordsman clenched his fist.
"We're on our way, Sephiroth."
The airship had grown steadier the further they went, presumably adjusting to the shift from casual flight to jet flight. Sid locked the wheel into place, keeping the airship on course, and turned to Cloud.
"Man, I'm going to stick it to him,"
he said eagerly. The pilot had a brand new spear that Shara had purchased for him, to replace his broken one. He was eager to use it. Suddenly and without warning, the airship shuddered violently. A siren began to ring and the red alarm lights flashed in warning. Sid cursed and rushed back to the wheel, which was shaking violently. The pilot released the auto lock and the wheel lurched to the side, but Sid grabbed it and pulled it back into place with all his might. The high wind steadied itself, but continued to shake violently.
"What is it, Sid?"
asked Cloud. The others gathered around him. If this was merely turbulence, it was the most intense turbulence they had ever felt before. Sid was unable to reply. He was far too busy fighting to keep the airship in the air.
"Erg,"
he grunted. Another wave hit them and the high wind gave another lurch upwards.
"Some incredible force,"
he managed to shout over the whir of the siren.
"Losing control."
It must be some remnants of the northern barrier, the pilot thought. He gritted his teeth and struggled against the force. At that moment the door to the bridge opened and the high wind's crew burst in. The young men gathered around Sid and helped to hold onto the wheel, keeping it in from breaking free. Sid, however, did not seem pleased to see them.
"Get the hell outta here, flunkies!"
he raged at them.
"Didn't I tell you all to go home?"
The crew members were not deterred, nor did they move.
"Yes, sir,"
said one of the workers.
"This is our home."
Sid cursed.
"Oh ma!"
He stopped as the high wind gave yet another violent shudder, breaking through another leftover wave of energy from the northern barrier. The wheel was almost wrenched from his hands, but the extra support given to him by the high wind's crew kept it in place. The pilot looked to his left and then to his right, at the eager faces of his voluntary crew. He sighed heavily.
"Stop trying to act so cool,"
he said. He then turned back to the wheel.
"All right, you jokers. Hold me down with everything you got. Geronimo."
With that, Sid pushed the engines to the maximum. The high wind burst forward suddenly, shaking free of the unseen force that had taken hold of it and fighting its way through. Sid roared angrily, unrelenting. Everyone could feel the tension in the air as the high wind pushed forward and then broke free with a loud snap. The high wind surged forward again and hurtled over the mountains. The northern cave, the final destination in this story, was just ahead. End of part 14. Next, final part, the one-winged angel. End of chapter. Episode 42, Part 15, Chapter 40. Part 15, The One-Winged Angel. Chapter 40. The high wind came to a stop at the summit of the northern crater. The outside of the crater was so rugged and steep it was impossible for the airship to land, and with no other landing spots nearby it instead just hovered over the peak. One of the high wind's crew threw a rope ladder over the side of the airship and lowered it until it reached the ground. He then handed Cloud and his companions their equipment and then stepped back, saluting them. The companions nodded their heads in acquiescence and then climbed down the ladder. They gathered around the edge of the crater, peering down. The inside of the crater was just as harsh a terrain as it was outside, as years of weathering had worn away the rock. As they peered inside they were surprised to see that there was a path winding along the inside of the crater, heading deep into the crater. It blended perfectly into the natural formation of the rock, so it appeared to be naturally made, but they knew that this was impossible. Perhaps it was Sephiroth's doing, they thought, daring them to come down and challenge him. Cloud knelt at the edge of the crater. He looked all the way down to the very bottom. He had expected a black, shadowy pit with no end, and so he was surprised to find that he could see the bottom. A large, glowing pool of Mako filled the bottom of the northern crater, its light so pure and so bright that it lit up the inside of the crater like a giant, glowing torch. But there was something else at the bottom of the crater, something that could not be seen with the naked eye. Cloud could feel it in his soul. Sephiroth was also down there, waiting for them. He could feel Sephiroth's presence down there, like an infection invading the planet. And he could also tell, from deep inside, that Sephiroth was aware of them. He knew that they were coming. Cloud scowled and rose to his feet. He turned to his friends.
"Looks like we can only slide down,"
he said to them. His friends nodded. Cloud descended first. He climbed over the edge of the crater and began to make his way carefully down the hole. The crater wall was rough and rugged, and there were plenty of hand and footholds to grab onto. The others made their way down after him, making their way down slowly. As he climbed down, Cloud wondered just what had crashed into the planet to cause this kind of damage. Was it another disaster, like meteor? Perhaps someone, long ago, had used the black materia to call meteor, and the collision had caused the damage. Or perhaps it was Genova, the calamity from the skies. Did this crater form when she descended upon the planet? Who knew? The companions made their way steadily down the wall, heading for the path below. Then there came the sound of falling rock as Red 13 lost his footing. The hound slid down the rock face, scrabbling for a foothold. He clawed the wall but could not get a grip, and tumbled all the way down until he hit the path below. Everyone held their breath. The hound lay still for a moment, and then rose to his feet. Everybody sighed, he was okay. Red 13, still stunned from his fall, sat and waited for the others to finish climbing down. When he neared the end, Cat let his mog slip down and jumped off at the end. The others did the same, gathering at the top of the path. They must have descended only 30 feet, but already the top of the crater seemed so far away. They looked down to the bottom of the crater. The path wound around the inside about 3 times before it came to an end. There was a hole in the rock close to where the path ended, and this was where they headed. As they walked down, they heard a screeching roar from somewhere below them. They looked down and caught a glimpse of fluttering wings amongst the moving shadows surrounding the Mako pool. An Almon, a winged monster with a round body and one very large eye, flew up towards them. Its red eye turned to them. It screeched and then swooped towards them. Vincent swiftly drew his gun and fired a single shot. The bullet pierced the Almon's large eyeball, and came straight out the other side. The monster gave a single pain shriek before it stiffened and fell down towards the Mako pool. It splashed into the life stream and sank beneath its surface. Vincent sheathed his gun. He shared a quick glance with Cloud. The two had the same thought, it would only get worse from here on out. The companions continued down the winding path, going deeper and deeper into the northern crater. Occasionally they looked up at the high wind, still hovering overhead, and wondered if this would be the last time they laid eyes on the airship. They reached the end of the path and walked through the opening in the crater wall. The air was warmer in here and heavy with the scent of Mako. It was also very dark inside, they could barely see anything in front of them. Sid lit up one of the flares they had brought with them and used it to guide their way. It was a good thing he did, for without it they would quickly have plummeted to their deaths. There were more paths inside the crater wall, but they were so old and worn down that many of them had crumbled away, leaving sizable gaps. Some paths crumbled as they stood on them, forcing them back. In many instances the companions were forced to jump over the smaller gaps in order to progress. One thing that was plentiful inside the North Cave was monsters. There were more Almon, gargoyles, and Master Tonberries, and many more that had never been seen before. Somewhere below them they heard the heavy, thudding footsteps of an armored golem as it wandered the vast caverns. Most of the monsters, thankfully, paid them no mind, and so they hurried on, following the light of Sid's flare. The crumbling paths came to an end. The companions slid carefully down a set of slender, rocky pillars and gathered on the next path, which branched off in 2 directions. The left-hand path went further ahead, while the right-hand one went down in a steep slope. Sid shone the light of the flare down each of the 2 paths. There was not much to see and it was impossible to tell which way they should go.
"The road splits into 2, said Cloud. "We'll split into 2 groups."
Around him, the others nodded. While they were reluctant to split up at this point, it was more practical if they wanted to cover more ground quickly. Cloud relayed the plans, they would split into 2 teams, 1 team taking each path. If one team found something or they reached a dead end, they would contact the other with the PHS. In that case, the companions would regroup and then decide what to do next.
"Which way are you gonna choose, Cloud?"
asked Sid. Cloud folded his arms, thinking how he should best split the teams. Before he could choose anyone, Tifa stepped forward to stand beside him. That was one person down. Cloud also chose Red 13 and Vincent to go along with him down the left-hand path, while Barrett, Sid, Kat, and Yuffie would make their way down the sloping right-hand one. The two groups stood apart, looking silently at one another.
Now,
Cloud said, giving Barrett and his group a stern look.
Don't any of you die on me. Gotta get through to Sephiroth.
Barrett's group nodded. At this stage in their journey, death was unthinkable. Though they were not invincible, it was hard to believe that there was much left that could stop them from reaching Sephiroth. Sid raised his spear and hefted it onto his shoulder. Its metal tip glinted bright red in the light of his flare.
I'll destroy that Sephiroth before anyone gets to him,
he said. Then, with his flare over his head, he began to march solidly down the sloping path.
It's all over now,
said Vincent.
With this.
He turned away, his frayed red cape fluttering behind him, and walked down the left-hand path. Yuffie watched as Sid and Vincent headed down each of the two paths. The ninja then sagged and sighed heavily, lowering her head.
Oh man. Materia Hunter Yuffie sounds like the last chapter of Materia Forever.
She shook her head, sighing again. Then she pushed herself upright, shook away her doubts, and ran after Sid. Kat Shi sat silently on the Mog's head. The Mog walked forward, past Cloud, and stopped at the entrance to the sloping pathway. The cat turned and faced Cloud, and then looked down. He scratched his head, and then looked at Cloud again.
I'm so happy to have met you all,
he said suddenly,
really.
Without another word he turned away, rubbed at his eyes, though how they could fill up was anybody's guess, and then left, the Mog hopping down the path.
Well,
said Barrett, walking over to Cloud.
Looks like this is our last big job.
He paused, looking at Cloud and Tifa. They knew what he meant. The last big job of Avalanche, the resistors of Shinra and defenders of the planet. Tifa closed her eyes and folded her hands over her chest. She hoped that somewhere Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie were watching, and were proud of what they were doing. Barrett then left, following Sid, Yuffie and Kat down the sloping path. As he left, Red 13 padded forward.
All life on the planet,
he said as he walked past Cloud and Tifa.
Indeed, the very life of the planet is in our hands.
The Hound then fell silent. Cloud watched him as he followed Vincent down the path. Since returning from Cosmo Canyon, Red 13 had been different. It was only during the flight from Midgar to the North Cave that Cloud found out why. Upon the Hound's return to his hometown, he had found Bugenhagen at death's door, weakened from his long journey home. The old man died that same night. But his grandfather's death helped Red 13 to make up his mind. He left Cosmo Canyon that next morning determined to fulfill his grandfather's wishes and protect the planet. Red 13 took a few steps down the path. He then stopped, his tail low, and looked up at the ceiling. Father. Grandfather. The Hound said silently to himself. Are you watching? Of course, he got no reply. Red 13 lowered his head and squeezed his eyes tight. His grandfather was at peace now, returning to the planet he had loved dearly. There was no time for sadness. Red 13 opened his eyes again and ran after Vincent. Now only Tifa and Cloud remained at the junction. Tifa turned to Cloud.
After this, we can go home,
she said to him.
All of us.
Cloud nodded. Yes, after this day, everything would be done with. They had only to get through this one day. He clenched his fist tight.
This will be the end of it,
he replied. Tifa smiled and nodded back, and ran off down the path after her friends. Cloud stayed just a moment longer, watching as his friends split off down their separate paths. This would be the end of it. He'd make sure of it. Barrett and his group headed further down the crater, following the light of the flare. Yuffie, bored by the slow pace and lack of action, ran on ahead to see if there were any hidden traps waiting to be sprung. To her disappointment, there was nothing. The ninja stopped and placed her hands on her hips. She would have thought that here, of all places, there would be some exciting traps, or rare and powerful materia waiting to be picked up. Perhaps, she thought to herself, she would even find the black materia. If she had that, then Wutai would surely be restored to its former glory, and woe betide anyone who tried to invade after that. She also wondered if Cloud would agree to give her all the materia they had collected. A scurrying sound caught her ear, and the ninja froze, listening. At first she heard nothing and wondered if it had been her mind playing tricks on her. Then the sound came again, this time a little closer. Yuffie slowly reached behind her and unhooked her crystal cross. She inched forward, peering into the shadows where the flare's light did not reach. She caught a flash of movement. Yuffie turned her head and gave a low whistle. Barrett and the others heard her warning and stopped, standing perfectly still. Yuffie inched her way forward. She tread carefully, not wanting to alarm whatever it was that was lurking ahead of them. The shuffling sound came again, and again it was closer than before. The ninja saw something scuttling amongst the shadows. She raised her shuriken, waited, and then threw it. The crystal cross clanged loudly as it landed in the rock. Something reared up and gave a high-pitched, panicked shriek, and then scurried away at high speed. Yuffie ran forward to see if she could spot it, but it had already disappeared.
"What in hell's name was that?"
asked Sid. He and the others walked forward to join Yuffie, and the light of the flare lit up the path. There was no sign of the creature. Yuffie bent down and pulled her shuriken out of the rock.
"I don't want to know,"
Barrett replied gruffly.
"This whole place gives me the creeps." "Who knows what else could be lurking down here,"
said Kat. He hopped forward on his mog and peered around. He turned back to Sid and the others.
"Let's just get moving,"
he said.
"I'm sure this place must lead us somewhere. Somewhere to nowhere, or into trouble at the very least,"
Sid muttered under his breath. He glanced at the flare. It was already almost halfway down. He thought of Cloud and his team, wondering if they had found anything. Then, turning his thoughts to the task at hand, he hurried after the others. At that moment Cloud and his group were still making their way through the vast catacomb of tunnels that wound through the northern cave. The path that had seemed easy at first suddenly turned treacherous, as it made a drastic curve downwards. The change was so sudden that nobody noticed it until they walked right into it and went sliding down the slope. Vincent tried to grab onto Cloud and Tifa, but they were just out of his reach. Red 13 dug his claws into the rock, trying to slow himself down, but he was moving so fast that he was unable to get a grip. They slid along, helpless, until they finally reached the bottom. The path stopped at the peak of an immensely tall, jagged pillar of rock. The platform they now stood on connected to a path that wound like a spiral around the outside of the pillar. The pillar became thinner in the middle before widening at the end, like a stretched-out hourglass. Brushing themselves off, Cloud and his friends descended down the path. Here and there the walls of the cavern glowed brightly in shades of blue, green, and red infused with the life stream. Mako flowed in abundance down here. If Shinra had known just how much Mako there was in the North Cave, they would surely have built a reactor here. Thankfully, the hazardous terrain made that impossible, and so the life stream flowed freely, unhindered by humankind. The companions stayed close to the wall as they followed the path, fearing that they would once again lose their balance. At the pillar's thinnest point the path stopped, and they had to slide carefully down the central point to where the pillar widened out and the path restarted. They moved quickly but carefully, and when they reached the bottom they hurried on. They were mostly undisturbed by the North Cave's natural inhabitants. Now and then they saw them, lurking in shadowy crevices and holes, watching them closely. Movers hopped past without a care, uninterested. One magic pot, a wretched-looking purple goblin hiding in an enchanted pot, shied fearfully away from, terrified by the glowing light of the flare. Small monsters were not the only things that made their home down here. As they passed a gap in the cavern wall, Vincent stopped to peer through into the adjoining cavern. A massive dark dragon with wings the same size as the High Wind had made its lair amongst the underground tunnels. The dragon was currently sleeping, digesting a full meal. There were many Gai corpses scattered throughout its lair. For now, the beast was sleeping, and so the companions hurried, quietly, onward. The path then took a turn and sloped upwards, and they came to a rocky ledge. Around them the rocks glowed with a burning orange light, making them seem almost ablaze. What was more amazing, though, were the bony remains of a giant serpent just ahead. The remains rested against the ledge and then wound their way down another tall pillar of rock, the serpent's final resting place. With no other way down, the companions ran across the skeleton's ribbed spine until they reached the bottom, and then started to hurry on.
"Well, hello."
The companions froze, startled. The voice that spoke was deep and alluring, it tried to lure them in. Their hands went to their weapons as they looked around, searching for the source. The voice laughed, and it echoed throughout the cavern.
"Up here."
They looked up. Sitting on one of the curved bones of the serpent skeleton's ribcage was a woman. She had long legs and tan skin, a rounded face and a head of long, thick raven hair that spilled over her shoulders and down her arms. Her shoulders, arms, and legs were bare, all she wore was a lime green swimsuit. She was also barefoot, and her feet tapped playfully against the bones. On first glance, the woman looked human. But one look into her eyes proved otherwise. Her pupils were deep red, and the whites were jet black. She was not a human. She was a monster. Unlike most monsters, she was an intelligent one, able to understand and speak the human language.
Well,
the woman said, her eyes watching them closely.
We don't get many visitors down here.
She drew her knee up to her chest and draped her arms around it, her fingers curling.
I am Palinsalta. Why don't you stay and play for a while?
Even as she spoke, Cloud could feel her spell tugging at him. Her words were enticing, her tone deep and hypnotic. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to lure them in, compel them to go to her. He fought against the spell, trying to block her voice from his mind. A gunshot rent the air, shattering the spell. Cloud felt her words slip from his mind, releasing him. He looked up. Palinsalta had stopped speaking. A lock of her hair, cut by the bullet, fluttered down onto the ground. Palinsalta, however, did not flinch. Vincent lowered his gun, a trail of smoke rising from the barrel.
We know you're kind,
the gunman said gruffly.
Your tricks won't work on us.
Behind him, Tifa sighed heavily. Only Vincent could be so indifferent that he could not be drawn in by this monster's spell of fascination. It was lucky for them that he had fired when he did, otherwise they would have been caught. Palinsalta looked at Vincent intently, taking him in. Her dark eyes narrowed. She inhaled deeply and then let it out in a long, hissing breath. Her lips, thin and raven-colored like her hair, parted in a cold, cruel smile.
My, aren't you the clever one?
She said. Her voice had dropped its alluring tone.
So my fascination won't work on you? Fine. Let's see you handle this.
She snapped her fingers. A wall of flames suddenly rose up in front of them, separating them from Palinsalta. The companions stepped back, and then stopped as another wall rose up behind them, cutting off their escape. Over the roar of the flames, Palinsalta laughed gleefully. From her perch she could see the four companions easily and was greatly amused as they looked about, trying to decide what to do. She snapped her fingers once more and two more walls of fire rose up at the sides, sealing them in a cage of deadly fire. Cloud looked around him. The flames surrounded them on all sides and showed no signs of stopping. He heard Palinsalta laughing. She knew that she had them trapped. The heat of the flames made him sweat, and he felt the air around him grow thinner as it was burned up by the flames. He began to pant heavily. Next to him, his companions were also beginning to struggle. He turned back to the flames and drew his sword. They had to break free of this cage before the air was used up.
Vincent,
he said breathlessly, turning to the gunman.
Your ice materia.
He then stopped, unable to say any more. The air was vanishing fast. Vincent did not respond. He knew what Cloud was getting at. The gunman raised his gun and pointed it at the flames. His ice materia flashed as he fired 5 rounds of ice bullets into the flames. They exploded as they came into contact with the flames, creating a gash in Palinsalta's cage. Hurriedly, they ran out. Welcome air washed over them, and they breathed it deeply. Palinsalta stopped laughing as she saw the companions escape from her prison. She scowled and snapped her fingers, causing the fire cage to dissipate. Once they had recovered enough to move, the companions ran forward. Palinsalta clicked her fingers, and bursts of fire erupted from the ground beneath them. The companions kept moving, they could not afford to be trapped in her cage again. Red 13 leaped over one blast of fire and landed on the skeleton's spine. He began to make his way back up along it, trying to get close to the monster. Vincent meanwhile, fired his gun. The monster saw the bullets coming and easily ducked to the side, grinning as the bullets slid past her face. Her dark eyes glinted in excitement as she snapped her fingers once more. Vincent was forced to duck and roll to the side as another explosion erupted behind him. Palinsalta then turned her attention to Red 13, who was nearing the top. She laughed and clicked her fingers. An explosion ripped through the spinal ridges just in front of the hound, causing them to blow apart. Red 13 yelped as the ridge he had landed on suddenly fell away beneath him, and he went tumbling back down towards the ground, disappearing in the smoke. Palinsalta then turned back, her fingers raised to create another explosion. The monster then froze as she saw Tifa soaring up towards her, thrown up by Cloud. The monster's hesitation gave Tifa the chance she needed as she struck out with one tightly clenched fist. She caught the monster on her jaw, knocking her head so far back it almost snapped. Despite the flames the monster created, Tifa noticed that her tan skin was icy cold. The monster shrieked as she fell back against the rib bone. She scurried back in alarm, frightened by the speed in which her carefully laid-out trap had turned on her. Tifa ducked down and swung her leg, trying to swipe the monster off the bone. Palinsalta must have recovered her confidence, for she placed her palms flat against the bone behind her head and flipped back, avoiding Tifa's leg. Tifa, angered, stood and charged at her, bringing her fist up for another painful blow. Palinsalta exhaled deeply, releasing a cloud of icy breath. Her breath touched Tifa's right arm as she brought it up, and Tifa cried out in pain and shock as her arm became so painfully cold it was almost unbearable. Still she did not stop and kept her fist moving forward, much to Palinsalta's alarm. Her fist smashed into the monster's gut, causing her to choke in pain. As she keeled over, Tifa grabbed her by the shoulders and swung her around, before throwing her down to the ground below. The monster landed with a heavy crash, shattering a pile of bones. Palinsalta opened her eyes. Cloud was standing over her, his sword raised over his head to finish her off. The monster's eyes widened in panic and she rolled to the side. The monster ran to the nearby wall and jumped up from ledge to ledge. She stopped at the top and glared back down at them, her eyes flashing angry.
"You'll pay for this,"
she said with a hiss, and then disappeared through a crack in the wall. Tifa jumped down from the skeleton and walked to stand beside Cloud.
"Well, that was bizarre,"
she commented.
"Why'd she suddenly give up like that?"
Vincent sheathed his gun and walked past her. He stopped by Red 13, who was still brushing himself off from his fall.
"Monsters of her kind are weak,"
the gunman said in answer to Tifa.
"They like their prey to be intimidated and to give up easily. They don't like it when the prey fights back." "Either way, we're wasting time,"
said Cloud. He looked up at the now broken spine of the serpent. There was no way they could get back up there now. They would have to keep going and hope that their path led them to Sephiroth. Cloud looked at his friends. They nodded.
"Let's go,"
said Cloud, and they hurried on. End of chapter. Episode 43, Part 15, Chapter 41. Chapter 41. At the end of the path they discovered another doorway. They went through it, and when they came out the other side they found themselves back along the inner wall of the north crater. The Mako pool glowed brightly some way below them. Its glow lit up the cavern walls, meaning they no longer needed a flare to light their way. The winding path continued here, circling the crater. It came to an end after the first loop, and to their amazement they saw that numerous rocky platforms, suspended in midair, carried on where the path left off. What mysterious power held these platforms in the air they did not know, but they did not question it. The platforms circled the crater wall and descended down towards the bottom of the crater. Cloud walked to the edge of the path and looked down. Showers of Mako streamed down the crater walls towards the pool, its cool heat washed over his face. Shielding his eyes with his hands he peered down, where he could just see a large platform suspended over the Mako pool, their destination. He could not see Sephiroth.
"Yo, we're a bit late."
The swordsman looked up. Barrett and his group were on the walkway overhead, after emerging from a second doorway in the rock. Cloud noted that they scuffle and dirt marks on their arms and faces. It seemed that they too had run into trouble. Barrett's group made their way down and rejoined the group. The 8 companions stood together on the path, looking down into the glowing light of the Mako pool. Cloud peered down to the final platform, just visible through the intense light.
"This is the center of the planet?"
he asked aloud. Nobody answered him. Cloud stood and jumped off the path to the walkway below and walked to the edge, where the first of the floating platforms hovered. The swordsman turned to his friends.
"Let's get going,"
he said.
"All right, everyone, let's mosey."
"Damn!" Sid cursed and waved his arms angrily. Everyone turned to him in surprise. The pilot ignored them and glared at Cloud.
"Again? Stop saying it like a wimp. Can't you say move out, or something?"
He crossed his arms huffily and tapped his foot. Cloud scratched the back of his head. Beside him, Tifa put her hands over her mouth and giggled to herself. Eventually, Cloud sighed.
"Move out,"
he said, with as much might as he could muster, just to please Sid. The pilot grinned, satisfied. The companions then moved forward. They were just about to jump down onto the first floating platform when a loud roar suddenly shook the cavern. They froze and looked up above them.
"What?"
exclaimed Barrett, his eyes widening. The crater walls above them were crawling with monsters, dozens and dozens of them. They poured out in great numbers of the holes dotted along the wall, all of them heading in the same direction, down towards them. Parasites scrabbled down the walls with ease, climbing down the walls and over the other monsters. When she saw them, Yuffie cringed, remembering the nest they had disturbed during their brief encounter with them in the caverns. Guy stood on the edge of the pathways, rearing up and screeching loudly. Christopher's winged beasts circled the air above them like vultures, waiting for the carnage to begin. One of the walls crumbled and an armored golem broke through, its large feet causing the paths to shake and quiver. Through another dark doorway the head of the dark dragon, now awakened from its slumber, slid out. Its eyes moved around until it saw the companions gathered below, and it roared. The sound of its roar startled the monsters, causing them to move away quickly. Even Pollen Salto was there, perched on a ledge, glaring down at them with a wide smile on her face. The companions stared in wide-eyed horror as the monsters began to swarm down the sides of the crater. Their intent was obvious: stop the companions before they could reach Sephiroth. The companions quickly gathered together, their hands on their weapons, ready to fight.
"Look at the number."
Red 13 breathed in disbelief. Never before had he seen so many monsters together in a single place. This was likely Sephiroth's doing.
"Shit!"
exclaimed Sid.
"They're coming out in full force."
He spat in disgust. Another wall, closer to them, crumbled and a second armored golem stomped out. Parasites poured out of the hole like cockroaches, swarming the walls. They could hear their insect-like screeching, and could see their antennae twitching. Barrett raised his gun arm and fired a single round at the rock just below the swarm. The parasites scattered but quickly regrouped and continued heading towards them.
"Cloud!"
shouted Barrett over his shoulder.
"You go first."
He fired again. Cloud shook his head.
"I'm fighting here too." "Shoo up!"
the former resistance leader snapped. He fired another few rounds and the parasites scattered again.
"It won't do us no good with everyone back here."
Beside him, Vincent fired a warning shot at a king behemoth. The monster took no heed and jumped down onto the next path.
"Barrett's right,"
said Sid. Cloud turned to the pilot in surprise. Sid took his cigarette out of his mouth and hooked it behind his ear. He then turned to Cloud, giving him a stern, level stare.
"You take 2 of us with you and go first,"
he told Cloud.
"The rest'll catch up with you later."
Tifa raised her fists.
"Is this like a practice run before the real thing?"
she asked. Cat shook his head miserably.
"Yeah, a major practice run." "Heh, I'm fine with that,"
said Yuffie. She drew both of her shuriken and added under her breath,
"It's probably more fun than fighting Sephiroth down there." This might be fun to pass the time,"
said Vincent, reloading his gun. Red 13 crouched down low and bared his fangs.
"They're coming,"
he growled.
"They're already on the floor next to us." "Cloud! Hurry up and make up your mind."
Cloud looked around at his friends, torn. He knew they were right. If they wasted time up here, all they would do was exhaust themselves and then they would never reach Sephiroth. They had no other choice but to split up again, one group to stay behind and fend off the approaching monsters, and the other to go down and face Sephiroth. But who should stay behind and who should go? Of all the choices Cloud had ever made, this was the most difficult of them all. Eventually, he made up his mind.
"Tifa! Red 13!
he called. At his command, Tifa and Red 13 pulled back away from the group to join him. Tifa, he knew, would want to go all the way and face Sephiroth. Red 13, however, would have great difficulty fighting here, on the narrow platforms. The Hound would be of much better use down below, where there was room for him to move. He wanted to take Vincent as well, with his expert aim, but his skills would be more essential here. When Tifa and Red 13 pulled back, the others closed ranks on the walkway. Cloud looked around at the friends who would be staying behind.
"All of you,"
he said.
"Later."
He would not say goodbye, not here. Barrett did not turn.
"Yeah, later,"
he replied. He, too, would not say goodbye. The man then raised his gun arm and opened fire on the approaching monsters. In the first few rounds alone, he took out several swarming parasites, whose bodies came crashing down onto the rocks. Yuffie gave an angry cry and stormed up the winding path, twirling her shuriken in her hands. She threw one and it went zipping up the crater walls, slicing through anything that got in its path. The others, too, began their assault. While the monster's attention was fixed on their friends, Cloud, Tifa, and Red 13 turned and jumped down off the ledge onto the first floating platform. Without waiting or looking behind them, they leaped onto the next one. They moved quickly, heading from one platform to the next, heading further down the crater. As they landed on the sixth platform, they passed through an unseen barrier, and the atmosphere around them changed. The air became closed and thick, drowning out the sounds of the battle going on above them. Everything around them seemed to slow down, even their own movements, making it seem as though they were moving in slow motion. Cloud stopped on the eighth platform and looked down at his hands. The air around them was shifting, pulsing with unseen energy. He could breathe easily through the closed air, but it left him feeling sick and lightheaded. The swordsman turned to Tifa and Red 13. They, too, had noticed this change in the air. Red 13 padded softly across the ground, testing his movements, while Tifa touched her throat anxiously. Cloud tried to speak to them, but the dense air dulled his words. Instead he gestured for them to carry on. The two nodded and followed him as he jumped down onto the next platform. They hurried on, moving as quickly as they could through the dense atmosphere. They followed the platforms as they circled the Mako pool, until at last they came to the very last one. The platform was large but covered only a tiny portion of the pool's surface, hovering above 20 meters above the pool. As they landed, the strange force that held them during their descent disappeared and everything returned to normal, changing so suddenly that they lost their balance and fell forward onto the platform. They quickly climbed onto their feet and looked around. The platform was made up of a number of square pillars that rose in uneven levels. It was quiet this far down the crater, they could hear nothing except for the movements of the live stream below. Clouds of steam rose from below, shrouding the platform in an unnatural glow. Cloud walked forward, his footsteps echoing loudly.
"Where are we?"
he asked aloud. His voice sounded hollow and surreal. Before anyone could answer him, a loud and piercing shriek filled the air. Tifa put her hands over her ears.
"What?"
she cried. Red 13 raised his head and sniffed the air. A foul scent filled his nostrils, and his ears dropped down low as he growled menacingly. Cloud followed the hound's gaze to the far end of the platform and cautiously walked towards it. There was something rising up from beneath the life stream. The surface bubbled and swelled and then fell away in waves as the creature that had been hiding inside broke the surface and rose up swiftly. It moved so fast that Cloud did not have time to back away and he found himself suddenly staring into its face. His eyes widened.
"Genova!"
Indeed it was Genova, but she looked entirely different. Before she had been a tall monster shrouded in folds of flesh, giant and terrifying. Now she was a giant, bloated ball. She had gorged on the life stream so that her body had become round and swollen. Flakes of petal-shaped flesh rose out around her head and over her body, rising and falling as she breathed. The scariest thing of all was her face. That horrible face that was stretched out into an eternal scream. The sight of it reminded Cloud of Hojo in his Helletic form, his body twisted by Genova's cells. That face, long and stretched, with eyes that were covered in a thin, fleshy film that stared unseeing into their hearts. They could feel her hate and her hunger through her eyes alone. Cloud stared. This was the Calamity in her truest form, bloated and gorged and always seeking more. Was she coming to protect her son? Or was she like the rest of the monsters, seeking only death and destruction? Cloud did not know exactly what this calamity was, but it was unlikely to be the former. Cloud reached behind him and drew his sword, held it out in front of him. He stepped back, slowly, and Genova in turn inched forward onto the platform. Two long, vine-like tentacles reached up from just beneath her head and slammed onto the platform, pulling her along. She stared at Cloud, Mako dripped from her mouth. Then, suddenly, she attacked.
"It's coming!"
Genova surged forward with surprising speed. Her two tentacles whipped out and struck Cloud before he had time to defend himself. One tentacle missed and hit the ground, but the other struck him hard across the face. The swordsman was thrown to the side and hit the ground hard. He rolled and lost his grip on his sword, which skidded across the platform. The arms whipped again, this time heading for Tifa, who was running in for an attack. The young fighter expected the attack and quickly dodged and rolled out of the way, letting them sail past her before she got up and charged right up to Genova's unguarded face. Up close the Calamity's face was even more terrifying, so terrifying that it almost made Tifa stop in her tracks. Almost. She mustered her courage and struck the Calamity a devastating blow in her misshapen face. She could hear bones crack, but Genova seemed to be in no pain. The fighter drew back her other fist and struck again. More bones cracked, crushed beneath her might, but still the Calamity did not react. The fighter struck again and again, delivering blow after blow, determined to keep the Calamity from paying any attention to anything else. Something wrapped around her waist and hoisted her into the air. Tifa cried out in alarm and tried to pry the tentacle away, but its grip was like iron and she could not budge it. Genova lifted her high up and then threw her as easily as if she were but a small rock. Tifa landed hard on the edge of the platform. She rolled quickly away from the edge and pulled herself to her feet. Her vision swam, but she just shook her head and charged forward once again. She passed Red 13, who leaped over the thrashing tentacles as they sought to snatch him off the ground. The hound dived and latched onto the skin behind Genova's petals. He closed his jaws around the bulbous flesh and yanked hard. The flesh was thick and tasted bitter, but he managed to tear a large chunk of it open. As he did so, a foul taste filled his mouth. Red 13 opened his eyes and saw thick, green ooze seeping out of the skin, falling over his paws and face. Hurriedly Red 13 released his hold and pulled back. The ooze was like glue and stuck to his face and fur. It had a heavy scent that made him dizzy, and though he had not swallowed any of it, Red 13 could already feel its poisonous effects trying to take hold. Red 13 shook his head, shaking off the venomous bio-oil. If he had held on any longer, he would have been in trouble. Genova raised her tentacles and crossed them over her head. She shrieked painfully and the hot flash of Ultima ripped its way across the platform. Cloud ran in front of Tifa and blocked the blast of light with his sword. The metal burned hot in his hands, singing his gloves, but he held on fast. Tifa clung onto his shirt, her eyes shut tight. After a few moments Ultima's light faded. Cloud lowered his sword. Smoke rose from his burned gloves, and when Tifa opened her eyes she was horrified to see blood dripping where the leather had burned away entirely. Forgetting the danger, Tifa ran in front of him and held closed her fingers around his hand. Her cure materia glowed with a gentle light, and soothing steam rose from the wounds as they slowly healed. Outraged by the interference, Genova darted forward again. Cloud and Tifa parted quickly, ducking and diving out of the way as her tentacles came slamming down into the ground between them. One tentacle managed to grab Tifa around her waist again and sent her flying across the platform, slamming her into the ground. The other tentacle reached for Cloud, but he leaped over it and darted towards Tifa. He swung his sword and sliced through the tentacle holding her down. Genova screeched in pain and brought her injured arm to her, cradling it. The severed tip flapped about like a fish out of water, and then became still. Despite the amount of life stream she had ingested, she was not invulnerable. With Genova's attention diverted, Red 13 called upon the Titan materia and summoned the great being onto the platform. Titan charged forward, his giant bulk causing the platform to shake with every step. He raised one gigantic fist and slammed it right into Genova's face, striking with 10 times more force than Tifa could ever hope to muster. The Calamity was thrown back, green-black blood pouring from her left eye, crushed when Titan hit. The Calamity landed with a thud, bounced like a ball, and then rolled to a stop. Her tentacles waved about in confusion. As Titan returned to the materia from whence he had been summoned, Cloud ran forward. He thrust out his sword and shoved it right into Genova's belly. The Calamity shrieked in pain and anguish as the Buster's sword sliced through her, ripping organs apart. Blood spurted over the wound and drenched the blade, but Cloud was not done with her yet. He twisted the blade, pulling it vertical. He then began to pull it downward, intending to slice the Calamity wide open. Realizing his intent, Genova's uninjured tentacle whipped around and closed fast around his waist. It then slid up, winding around him. It pinned his arms to his sides, forcing him to release the Buster's sword. It moved upwards still and wound its way around his neck. The Calamity lifted Cloud up into the air and began to squeeze. Cloud! Tifa tried to run to him, but the wounded tentacle suddenly lashed out and struck her below her ribcage, flattening her once again. Red 13, the only one able to move, dived and latched onto the arm. He started to yank but was forced to let go as more poisonous ooze seeped out of the Calamity's pores. The hound turned to Genova and growled warningly, but the Calamity simply ignored him and carried on squeezing. The hound tried to draw her attention by casting a fireball, but it did nothing but slightly char her flesh. Genova continued to tighten her grip. Cloud coughed and choked, but suffocating him was not Genova's objective. What she wanted was to snap the swordsman's neck clean in two. She tightened her grip further still, and there was a hint of a malicious smile on her malformed face as Cloud cried out. A shot fired and ripped through the arm. It severed and Cloud dropped down onto the floor. Genova cried out and curled her arm towards her. Cloud reached up and pulled the slackened arm away from his neck. He took deep lungfuls of air, too thankful to have air again to notice the shower of bullets that were raining over his head and driving Genova back. The swordsman wriggled free of the flapping tentacle and crawled over to Tifa.
"Are you all right?"
he asked her, his voice hoarse. The fighter sat up. As she moved, she winced and clutched at her ribs. She swallowed the pain and nodded.
"Yes,"
she said. Cloud touched her shoulder, but she just shook her head. She placed her hand over her chest, and the cure materia glowed. While Tifa worked to heal herself, Cloud finally looked up to see what had caused Genova to cease her attack. To his amazement, he saw Vincent standing on the platform above them. The gunman had his gun raised and was firing on Genova. His shots struck the ground in front of her, forcing her back. The Calamity screeched with each shot, cradling her injured arms to her. When she was far enough away, Vincent jumped down, breaking through the barrier, and walked over to Cloud and Tifa.
"Vincent?"
Cloud called, surprised.
"What are you doing here? I thought you were with Barrett and the others."
Vincent stopped beside them and regarded Cloud calmly.
"I thought you might need some help dealing with her. They can handle things."
He looked down at Tifa, who was still holding her ribs.
"I'm all right,"
she said quickly, guessing his thoughts. Vincent raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He looked up over Cloud's shoulder. His eyes widened.
"Cloud!"
he shouted. He pushed the swordsman aside and then quickly scooped Tifa up in his arms and leaped backwards, just as Genova suddenly surged forward and slammed one of her arms onto the platform. Even as he moved, Vincent was assessing the current situation. Red 13 was keeping his distance, trying to find an opening. Cloud's sword, he noted, was stuck in Genova's underside. The blade was wedged in deep, she was badly wounded. Still, this was Calamity from the skies. She would not go down easy. Vincent gently lowered Tifa onto the floor. The fighter started to stand, but Vincent placed a gentle hand on her shoulder.
"Stay there,"
he said.
"Heal yourself first."
Tifa looked up at him defiantly, but then she sighed and sat back down.
"All right,"
she said. She put her hand over her chest. She was in no position to argue. Vincent left Tifa and rejoined Cloud, who stood nearby. Genova watched him closely as he moved, her body turning slowly. She, too, was assessing the situation. Vincent looked over at Cloud.
"Do you have a plan?"
he asked. Cloud shook his head.
"It's fast,"
he replied. He looked down at his gauntlet, to the 3 balls of summon materia.
"And there's not enough room for me to summon Bahamut."
He looked at Vincent.
"Odin."
"Perhaps," said the gunman, giving it some thought.
"Though there are other ways to use summon materia."
He reloaded his gun and clicked the barrel shut.
"But first, you need your sword back. I'll provide cover. You get your sword back."
Cloud nodded. It was as good a plan as any. Vincent raised his gun and ran forward, and Cloud ran close behind him. Vincent opened fire and then swerved sharply to the left. As he expected, Genova turned with him, shrieking in rage. Cloud, meanwhile, swerved to the right and ran along Genova's other side. The Calamity whipped one of her arms around to strike at him, but Red 13 dived in and latched onto it, pinning it to the floor. Cloud jumped over the hound and ran into where the Buster sword was still sticking out of Genova's gut. With one hard tug he yanked the blade out. Genova screamed in agony and swung her arm again, even with Red 13 still attached to it. Cloud turned and ducked down, letting the arm sail over his head. It slammed into the ground, and Red 13 quickly reaffirmed his grip and pressed down on it with all his weight. The Calamity tugged, but the hound had a firm hold, she could not move it. Genova started to turn, but stopped as bullets ripped through her right-hand side. She turned her back on Cloud, and headed towards Vincent. That was the moment Cloud was waiting for. He lunged and swung the sword in a tight upward strike. The blade cut a long, deep gash in Genova's leathery body. The swordsman kept on moving, letting his momentum carry him forward. He struck again, this time in a downward arc, and cut another deep wound in Genova's bulbous body. The Calamity shuddered and struggled forward, trying to get out of the range of Cloud's blade. Yet as she moved forward, Vincent opened fire, forcing her back. He ran along the outer edge of the platform, keeping out of range of Genova's one remaining free arm. He paused to reload his gun and fired another set of rounds at the Calamity. The Calamity turned from him to focus on Cloud, who was her immediate threat as he cut numerous deep gashes into her side. Vincent saw her arm whip round, and quickly he fired a shot at the point where her arm joined to her neck. The bullet ripped through the flesh, tearing through the muscle. The arm fell limp, useless, leaving Genova defenseless. Realizing this, the Calamity pulled back, trying to move out of range of Cloud's blade. But Cloud was far from finished. He whistled to Red 13, who released Genova's arm and ran over to join him. The two ran forward, Red 13 pulling ahead. The hound jumped and dug his claws into the Calamity's back, getting a firm hold. Cloud then jumped and landed on the hound's shoulders, before he jumped again and landed on Genova's top half. The Calamity turned about in confusion, bewildered by this sudden change in tactic. Cloud raised his sword over his head, intending to plunge it right into the Calamity and end it right here. Because you are a puppet. Cloud stopped. He hesitated. In that instant, Genova's arm whipped up and swiped him from her back. The Buster's sword was wrenched from his grasp as the blow sent him flying back. The blade spun rapidly through the air before striking the ground, its tip embedded in the rock. Cloud hit the ground near the Buster's sword. The swordsman rolled onto his back and stared up at the walls of Mako that showered down the crater walls, and the floating platforms of rock that dotted the air. His vision then blurred as waves of dizziness overcame him, and everything blurred together into one giant, glowing green light. Slowly, Cloud turned his head and looked up at the Buster's sword standing beside him. Unlike everything else, the image of the Buster's sword was perfectly clear. Cloud focused on it, as though seeing the blade for the first time. There were many scrapes and scratches along the wide metal blade now, worn from all the battles it had to endure. Cloud blinked. Had it always been like that? When had it started looking so worn? A piercing roar brought Cloud back to reality. The swordsman shook his head, clearing the fog, and rolled onto his front. He pushed himself to his knees and looked up. Ahead of him, his friends were still fighting. Tifa, now healed, had rejoined the battle and was calling his name. Red 13 had leaped onto the Calamity's back and was attacking ferociously, biting and scratching. Vincent continued to run along the edge of the platform, firing his gun wherever he could find an opening. Genova's body was drenched in blood, some of it their own. As Cloud watched, Genova opened her mouth and unleashed another wave of Ultima magic. Tifa flipped out of the way as the magic ripped through the ground, churning up the rock. It hit one of the giant boulders that bordered the platform. The boulder broke free and fell down into the life stream below, sinking beneath its surface. His mind now clear, Cloud grabbed onto the hilt of the Buster's sword and pulled himself to his feet. His fingers lightly touched the blade, passing over the scratches. A puppet. Yes, he had been a puppet. Sephiroth had used him well, but no more. Sephiroth and Genova would control him no longer. He would make his own choices now. And his first choice would be to end this battle now, and put an end to Genova. Cloud pulled the Buster's sword out of the rock. He held it ready before him. He took a breath, and then charged. Genova turned as she saw him coming, but it was too late. Cloud raised his sword above his head and leaped into the air. With an angry cry, he brought the blade down on Genova's head. The blade sliced cleanly through Genova's neck, severing her head from her body. The Calamity gave a strangled cry before her voice died out, and her head fell down onto the ground at Cloud's feet. The now beheaded body quivered, still struggling to hold on to life even as it seeped away. The arm made one last attempt as it reached, shakily, for Cloud, but fell limp as the life finally left it, dropping down onto the floor. Cloud lowered his sword. He breathed heavily, his lungs aching. He watched as Genova's body slowly lowered itself onto the ground. The life then left the rest of the body, and it sagged. With nothing left to hold it up, the body began to roll across the platform like a horrible, bloodied ball. It reached the end of the platform and rolled over the edge. It fell back into the life stream, landing with a loud splash. It bobbed like a cork for a second or two before sinking out of sight. Silence fell upon the platform as those last few moments sank in. Cloud looked down to where Genova's head lay. The head, too, was lifeless, but left a horrifying image in Cloud's mind. One eye was busted, stained with blood. The jaw was broken by repeated blows from Tifa and Titan. Cloud set his lips into a firm line and raised his sword again, intending to destroy this final remnant of the Calamity from the skies. A strong quake suddenly shook the platform, and Cloud stopped. He looked up in alarm as the platform began to break apart around him. The giant chunks of rock that surrounded the platform crumbled and fell down into the life stream below. The rising square pillars on which they stood separated, some of them falling down into the life stream while others floated upwards. He saw Red 13 leap back as the pillar he was standing on rose rapidly upwards. Cloud heard Tifa call his name, and he turned to run to her. A bright light flashed, and the ground beneath his feet disappeared. The swordsman found himself falling, cool air rushing past his face. The bright light of the life stream rushed up to meet him. He fell into it, and he cried out as its burning light washed over him, swallowing him up entirely. He could not see the others, but he knew that they were there. He could feel their presence near him, and he felt energized with renewed courage. This was not the end. The light faded. It turned into darkness, a darkness that Cloud remembered well from when he last fell into the life stream. He could feel its cool sensations pass over him, replacing the burning light. It wrapped around him like a cold blanket, gently smothering him. Cloud tried to fight against it, but he could not fight it for long. Slowly it began to win him over, yielding to its might. Then, a light appeared. It was a small light, but it cut through the unending darkness, releasing Cloud from its hold. The swordsman looked into it. Though it was only a small light, trapped by the darkness, he could feel immense power pulsing within it, yearning to break free. Cloud's eyes widened.
Li. GHT.
He said.
A light. Is this light holy?
Cloud headed towards that light. Before he could reach it, a harsher, brighter light flashed and took hold of him. It yanked him away, dragging him away from holy. To where it was taking him, Cloud had no idea. End of chapter. Episode 44, Part 15, Chapter 42. Chapter 42. The light faded. When it did, it released its hold on Cloud, dropped him down onto a floating podium of rock. A second later, the Buster's sword clattered down beside him. Cloud opened his eyes slowly, and winced as a bright light hit them. He shut them again and shook his head. He reached out and closed his fingers around the hilt of his sword, pulling it towards him. A series of thumps and thuds sounded around him.
"Oh!"
said a disgruntled voice.
"Damn, man!"
Cloud's head snapped up. He looked to his right. To his surprise, he saw Barret on another floating podium just a little ways above him. As Cloud watched, the big man pushed himself up onto his knees and rubbed dirt from his eyes.
"Barret,"
said Cloud, blinking in disbelief. Barret stopped rubbing his eyes and looked over at Cloud. He, too, blinked.
"What?"
he asked in confusion. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. Just a few seconds ago he had been above the Mako pit, backed up against the wall as he tried to fend off attacks from one of the armored golems that had managed to break through their defenses. Then a bright light appeared, and before he knew it, he had landed here, on this floating rock. He looked around. They had landed at the bottom of a large, cavernous pit, the true bottom of the northern cave deep beneath the life stream. Tall, rocky walls surrounded them on all sides, rising so high up above them they could not see where they led. Dozens of floating platforms of rock were dotted about the cavern, some close together, while others were further apart. Cloud and Barret were on two of the podiums closest to the bottom of the cavern. They were not alone. The others were here too, on more of the floating rocks. Tifa was on the rock between him and Cloud. Yuffie and Cat were to his right. On Cloud's left there was Sid, Vincent, and Red 13, just standing up. Everyone was accounted for, brought here by that strange light.
"So everyone's together again?"
he asked, climbing to his feet. Before anybody could reply, a flash of light lit the cavern, as bright as lightning. An unseen force grabbed hold of the group and lifted them up off the rocks. The companions wriggled, trying to break free of the unseen hands that held them, but their efforts were in vain. They hung suspended over the rocks, fighting against an unknown assailant with no idea how to break free. Before them, at the very center of the Mako pit, was a large globe of white light trapped in a prison of rock. A hole in the side of the rock allowed the light to shine through, but a powerful magic spell held it in thrall and kept it from escaping. It was from this globe that the force that held them now had come from. The globe pulsed with intense brilliance, and a ring of white light burst out of its center. It hit the companions, who cried out as their bodies were racked with a pain so intense that it drove the breath from their lungs and made them writhe about in agony. Never before had they felt something as agonizing as this. It felt as though every single part of them was being ripped apart, stabbed through, and electrified all at once. The pain continued to torture their bodies even after the light passed through them, unrelenting. They thrashed about in pain, unable to break free. As he writhed, Cloud's eyes turned towards the globe. Through the haze of pain he saw the shadow of a man appear in its center. The shadow moved closer, growing larger, and stepped out of the globe. The globe's light settled on the figure's back, shining brightly upon him. Cloud's eyes widened as he recognized the man floating before him. The silver hair and the cruel face, currently relaxed as though in sleep.
Sephiroth.
Upon hearing his name, Sephiroth slowly opened his eyes. He raised his head and settled his gaze on Cloud. His glowing eyes hardened, and his lips twisted into a cold, callous smile. That smile. He had seen that smile before, in Nibelheim. When Cloud had been lying on the ground outside the burning ruins of his home, he had caught a glimpse of Sephiroth's face through the flames. A smile filled with malevolence and hate, seeking to destroy everything. Sephiroth turned his gaze away from Cloud and looked around at the others who had come to challenge him. His eyes passed calmly over each one, assessing them. He was unimpressed with what he saw. The former soldier spread his palms and another ring of light burst out from the globe behind him. It hit the companions and pushed them back, racking their bodies with another wave of pain.
Ugh!
Grunted Barrett.
Is this the true power of Sephiroth?
Sid writhed, struggling to move against the unseen force. He tried to raise his spear, but his arms refused to cooperate.
My body,
the pilot said. His hand opened, and the spear fell down onto the rocks below. Sid gritted his teeth and writhed.
I can't control my body. Yoog!
The pilot cried out as he was suddenly yanked forward along with Cloud and the others. Sephiroth drew them close, and then at his command another ring of light burst from the globe and pushed them back out again. They screamed in pain as their bodies were flung back like dolls, and then stopped just as suddenly as the unseen force gripped them again and held them. Red 13 threw back his head and howled.
My front legs! My hind legs!
The hound squirmed and twisted his body.
My tail's about to tear off. This is definitely not good,
said Catshi.
He's way out of our league.
The cat struggled to keep a hold of his mog, which was being steadily ripped apart.
I don't know if I can. Go on,
said Yuffie beside him, her voice strained. Another ring of light passed through them, and once more the companions flinched as pain shot through their bodies. Tifa coughed and gasped for breath. Her lungs felt as though they were being crushed from the inside. Her heart beat rapidly in her chest, and her blood was pumping loudly in her ears. There was not a single part of her that did not ache with pain. She tried to look at Cloud, floating next to her. She could only just see him through the corner of her eye. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She closed her lids, and tears spilled down her cheeks.
Cloud,
she whispered voicelessly.
Cloud. Ugh! Ugh!
Cloud groaned. Another ring of light hit him, and the swordsman gritted his teeth tightly against the pain. He coughed and raised his head, looking over at Sephiroth.
There,
he said.
It's there. Cloud.
Tifa forced her head to the side, looking at him. Cloud took a few deep, shaky breaths. He swallowed and then gritted his teeth. Through willpower alone he pushed the pain aside and forced his racked body to move. He raised his right arm first, lifting up the Buster Sword. Then he raised his left arm and closed his left hand around its hilt. He then held the sword out in front of him. He breathed heavily. He could feel it. There, in front of him.
Holy! Holy! Is there? The holy is shining. Ares' prayer is shining.
Tifa followed his gaze. Behind Sephiroth, the large orb of light shone brightly. Cloud was right. Holy was there. She could feel it. Its presence was small, dwarfed by Sephiroth's presence. But its light was bright, shining. Holy was struggling on, even as Sephiroth threatened to shut off its light with darkness. Now she saw from where Cloud had drawn this strength. If Holy could continue to fight even in the presence of Sephiroth, then so could they. The fighter closed her eyes and brought Ares' image to her mind. She could feel Ares' presence with them, even in death. She was praying for their victory, praying for Holy to move.
Holy Eris,
Tifa said. She breathed in deeply, let it out slowly. Yes. The more she thought about Eris and Holy, the stronger she became.
It's not over yet,
said Cloud. He raised his sword higher and looked over at Sephiroth. Sephiroth's eyes narrowed and his smile grew wider. Cloud gripped the sword tighter.
This isn't the end yet,
he shouted defiantly. Sephiroth spread his palms. The companions lurched forward as they were drawn in once more and then thrown back out by another ring of Holy's bright light. However, instead of succumbing and screaming in pain, the companions began to fight back. Holy's presence gave them the strength that they needed to break free of the bonds that held them, releasing them from Sephiroth's grip. They rose up and surrounded Sephiroth and Holy.
Who okay?
Sid said, pushing back his sleeves.
I can't be fooling around in the bottom of this hellhole. I still have lots of stuff to do with my life.
Vincent rose up to float beside him.
Damn.
He cursed.
I was frozen in time. But now I feel as though my time is finally about to begin.
The gunman drew his gun from its holster.
Sephiroth, now it's your time to sleep between the ages. Maybe we were a little late in noticing the trouble that we were getting into,
Cat said regretfully. He clutched his megaphone close to his chest, remembering all the lives that had been lost due to Shinra's selfish greed.
But, there's still time. We should still be able to get out of it. Even if we can't get everything back to normal.
The cat held out his weapon.
We should be able to protect what's most important,
he cried, and his Mog raised its arms in agreement. Yuffie, meanwhile, looked torn.
Maybe I shouldn't have come,
she said hesitantly.
I don't need materia. Any.
She paused, shook her head, and her eyes flared up.
Nope, I still want it,
she announced proudly, unhooking her shuriken.
This and that and everything? Mine. And I'm never gonna give any up. No way we're gonna lose,
shouted Red 13. The Hound shook himself free of his bonds and floated up to join Vincent and Sid.
I'm going to see it through to the end. For the future. And that of the planet.
The Hound turned his gaze upwards, to the darkness that hovered over them.
I understand now, Grandpa,
he said.
This is my mission. I won't let the life stream, or the life of the planet, wither away.
Tifa rose up. She joined Cloud on his left-hand side, floating beside him. She pulled her gloves taut and clenched her fists tight.
We're not gonna lose,
she said to Sephiroth, her dark eyes blazing.
Eris is here. Everyone is here. Cloud is here with us. There's still so many things for us to do. I'm not giving up.
Barret rose up and joined Cloud on his other side.
Not only Eris. Holy is the prayer of Avalanche. Of Marlene and Dyne. And everyone on the planet.
That left only Cloud. The swordsman floated forward, the Buster's sword firmly in his hands. The sword's scarred, worn surface shone dully in Holy's light, but it remained as strong as ever. After all, it carried in it the hopes, dreams, and memories of those who had held it before him. Like Zack. Cloud would be the last to hold his sword, the last in a short legacy of brave swordsmen who put all their hopes into this one sword. Now it was time for the Buster sword to fulfill its fate. Cloud held the sword firmly and looked into Sephiroth's cold eyes.
Eris's memories,
Cloud began.
Our memories. We came to tell you. Our memories.
He turned his gaze to Holy, shining brightly behind Sephiroth.
Come planet. Show us your answer. And Sephiroth. To the settling of everything.
Sephiroth raised his eyes and looked at him. His gaze hardened, trying to pierce through his heart and will, but Cloud held firm and did not waver. Sephiroth looked around once more at Cloud's companions. They were the same. Their will did not waver before him. In fact, it had increased. Each one of them stood firm, set in their determination to bring this to an end and save the planet from his wrath. If this was the fate they chose, then so be it. He spread his arms wide, and the air around him became heavy with unimaginable energy. The air began to ripple like water, extending outwards from his being. It hit the companions, who surged forward to meet him. Holy flashed once, and a brighter, stronger ring of light burst out from its center and flung the companions harshly back away from Sephiroth. They slammed into the floating rocks scattered throughout the Mako pit, separated from each other.
So be it.
Sephiroth shouted, and with that he rose swiftly upward, disappearing into the darkness that hung like a dark cloud over the Mako pit. When he descended, his form had changed. The human being they knew as Sephiroth was gone, and in his place was the monster known only as Bizarro Sephiroth. He stood taller than a building, with monstrous shoulders and arms that ended not with hands but with powerful wings. He had two heads, one rising out of the other, both with eyes that were ice-cold blue and devoid of the warmth of life. At his waist there was a brightly glowing yellow orb, pulsing with power. Sephiroth spread his wing-like arms and floated down the pit to where the companions were just rising to their feet. When they saw Sephiroth's new form they hesitated, startled, but then gripped their weapons with fresh determination. It did not matter what form Sephiroth took. They would still beat him down. Sephiroth's heads turned and their gaze settled upon Cloud. He raised one large winged arm and brought it crashing down onto the rocky podium where the swordsman stood. Cloud jumped back out of the way of the feather fingers as they slammed into the rock. The strength of the blow cleaved the podium in two, sending chunks of rock tumbling towards the pit below them. These chunks of rock fell and then suddenly stopped and floated in midair, held up by the power of the life stream. Cloud glanced down at them before returning his attention to the monster before him. Sephiroth was raising his hand again, preparing another strike. The swordsman braced himself. A light flashed overhead, and Tifa's voice called out to him.
Cloud! Up here!
Cloud looked up and even Sephiroth halted his attack long enough to see Leviathan emerge from the light overhead and dive into the pit. Sitting on the serpent's back were Tifa and Yuffie, riding the dragon as it dived down to the broken podium. Sephiroth scowled and brought his hand down on the podium. Cloud turned and dived off just as Sephiroth's hand smashed into it, breaking it apart. The swordsman meanwhile landed on the floating rocks and jumped rapidly from one to another, using them as stepping stones. Leviathan flew alongside and Tifa held out her hand to Cloud. He took it, and she pulled him up onto Leviathan's back just as Sephiroth's hand swiped again. Leviathan screeched and soared back up to the sky, out of reach of Sephiroth. Sephiroth turned his head upwards and watched as Leviathan rose to a safe distance and circled the pit, watching him. Both heads smiled with evil intent and he raised his arms. Flames gathered around the tips of his feathery fingers. They formed into fireballs and he fired them off, one by one, up towards Leviathan. The serpent dodged and weaved through the fireballs as they soared past. One schemed Leviathan's tail, and the serpent roared in agony. He writhed and lashed his tail.
Wow, that was close,
said Yuffie, looking back. Leviathan was not hurt badly, the flames had only schemed it. The ninja sighed and turned to Sephiroth.
Watch where you're throwing those things,
she shouted angrily. Her words were met by another series of fireballs. Once more, Leviathan was forced to weave his way through as the air became hot with fire. This time he avoided being hit, but kept on moving to avoid being a still target. Sephiroth watched as Leviathan circled the pit, amused by their attempts to avoid his fire strikes. Once more he spread his hands and flames began to form, larger and more condensed, intent on bringing the serpent and his riders crashing down. A series of sharp, painful shots struck Sephiroth in his right shoulder. Sephiroth lowered his arms, the flames dissipating, and turned to look at the new attacker. Barret was standing on one of the lower platforms, gun arm raised and firing a continuous stream of bullets at the monster before him. Sephiroth raised his wing to shield himself from the bullets, and then without warning lunged and swiped his arm across the podium. His fingers swept over the rock and sent it spinning across the pit with Barret still on it. The resistance leader dropped down and clung to the rock as it spiraled wildly out of control. His world spun and then stopped with a great shudder as the rock slammed into the wall of the pit. Barret lost his grip on the rock and slid down towards the edge. He reaffirmed his hold just in time and held on tight. The rock remained in place, stuck in a crack along the wall of the pit. Barret tried to pull himself back up the rock, but lost his grip again and slid down and over the edge. For a brief moment he fell, before he landed heavily on an outcrop of rock almost directly beneath the podium. The man groaned and rolled onto his back. He breathed heavily, amazed. He was still alive. On the other side of the Mako pit, Vincent sat behind Odin as Sleipnir galloped across a winding path that circled the outer edge of the pit. Odin tugged on the reins and Sleipnir obediently turned and leaped off the path and onto one of the nearby platforms. 6 heavy hooves thudded into the dirt, churning up rock, but the horse plowed on regardless, leaping to the next platform and then the next. The horse followed the platforms as they moved across the pit, heading towards Sephiroth. Pausing briefly on one platform, Odin raised his spear and threw it at Sephiroth. The monster saw it coming and swiftly dodged to one side. The spear sailed past and struck the wall behind him. Sephiroth moved back and turned to face Vincent and Odin. He closed his wings over his torso, and the yellow orb at his waist began to glow. The air around it wavered, and sparks of light formed and were drawn into the orb. A beam of light suddenly burst out of the orb. Sleipnir jumped out of the way of the beam as it ripped through the rocky podium. It did not destroy the rock but obliterated it entirely, leaving not even a single trace of it behind. Sleipnir missed the beam only by a hair's breadth, signified by the steam rising from his rear hooves. After destroying the podium, the beam carried on and hit the far wall of the pit. It tore through the rock, incinerating it. The blast caused the pit to shake violently. The beam ended, and as the steam and smoke faded away, the damage to the inner wall became clear. There was a massive hole nearly 10 meters wide burned into the wall, and delving meters deep. Overhead, Cloud leaned over Leviathan's side and looked down at the hole.
"Did you see that?"
cried Yuffie, her eyes wide.
"There's no way we can fight against something like that. He's way stronger than us. This is just crazy." "It might be crazy, but we have no other choice," said Cloud. He leaned over Leviathan's side again, surveying the battlefield. Sephiroth had turned his attention away from them and was following Odin's horse as it darted around the pit, leaping from platform to platform, trying to find an opening. When Sephiroth turned his back, Cloud grasped Yuffie's shoulder. "Dive, Yuffie."
Yuffie sighed.
"If you say so."
She placed her hand on the serpent's long neck, stroking it.
"Leviathan, dive,"
she commanded. Leviathan obediently did as she bade and dropped into a steep dive. Yuffie, Cloud, and Tifa held tightly onto the serpent's scales as he dived. Air rushed past their faces, drowning out all other sounds. Sephiroth's monstrous blue form zoomed in to meet them, and at the last moment Cloud drew up his knees and pushed himself away from Leviathan. Tifa cried out to him, but Cloud was already moving, his sword in hand, falling down towards Sephiroth. The uppermost head heard Tifa's cry and looked upwards. He saw Cloud descending, his blade crackling with powerful electric light. Sephiroth scowled and pushed his palms into the cranium of the lower head. The long lengths of blue hair that framed its face rose up like antennae. Electrified energy began to crackle around them. Cloud brought down his sword and crashed headfirst into the energy. A loud and deafening explosion filled the air and the pit was filled with a wave of bright light. Yuffie and Tifa covered their eyes as a wave of electrified light swept over them, making the hairs on their arms and necks stand on end. Leviathan quickly pulled back and curled his tail around his body, protecting his riders. Cloud opened his eyes. The light was blinding. His blade pushed down on the two antennae-like bangs, trying to break through the shield of energy that separated him from Sephiroth. Electricity swept over his blade and over his hands, tightening the muscles, but Cloud gritted his teeth and kept on pushing. He would break through. Through the light he could see Sephiroth. The upper head glared back at him with eyes that were cold and empty and full of hatred, narrowed into thin slits. Cloud put all of his strength into his arms, pushing down on the shield of crackling light. It was a battle of wills between him and Sephiroth, and Cloud was not about to lose. The shield wavered. Cloud could feel it weakening. His will, his desire to protect his friends, gave him the strength that he needed. His blade cut through the shield and the light disappeared. With no barrier to separate them, Cloud dived forward. Seeing him approach, Sephiroth's eyes widened with interest. Was this the same puppet? Before he could finish that thought, Cloud was suddenly in front of him. Sephiroth met his gaze and grinned as Cloud landed in front of him, drew back his blade and then, with a cry, thrust it out with all his strength. The blade sliced through Sephiroth's neck, almost completely severing the head from its body. Cloud raised his sword and slashed again, and this time cut the head from the body. The rest of the companions stared in wide-eyed amazement as the bodiless head rolled down Sephiroth's broad back. Those in range caught a glimpse of the face as it fell. It was still grinning. The head plunged down and landed with a splash into the life stream. It sank out of sight, disappearing beneath the surface. Sephiroth spread his wings and flapped them gently. He did not seem at all fazed by the loss of his upper head. Instead, he just beat his wings harder and sent a powerful gust of swing sweeping throughout the Mako pit. Cat Shi clung to his mog as the podium he was standing on was caught up in the breeze and lurched suddenly upwards. It smashed into the wall and hung there, suspended at an angle. The collision made Cat lose his grip on the mog and he fell through the air. Red 13, running nearby, leaped and snatched the cat up in his jaws. The hound landed on the winding path surrounding the pit. He dropped Cat, who clambered onto his back. Then the hound set off with his new rider, running along the path to rejoin the others. The upper body sagged backwards, lifeless. With his job done, Cloud jumped back out of the way. As he descended, he caught a glimpse of movement and turned to see Ifrit slam into one of the lower platforms and then leap up towards Sephiroth. Sephiroth turned and swiped one of his large wings, brushing the fiery demon aside. Yet as soon as he did, he realized his mistake as Vincent, astride Sleipnir, leaped at him. Sephiroth opened his mouth and unleashed a stream of fire, but Sleipnir smoothly dodged to one side, missing the flames. Vincent stood up and pushed himself away from the horse. He raised his gun and fired 2 shots. Both shots struck Sephiroth in his round shoulder. The gunman landed on Sephiroth's shoulder and quickly jumped again, firing 2 more rounds into Sephiroth's other shoulder. They did little damage, but were enough to draw Sephiroth's attention long enough for Red 13, with Cat on his back, to leap onto a nearby podium and call upon Titan. The summon appeared before him and charged forward, his footsteps causing the platform to shake. Before Sephiroth could turn, Titan jumped, his fist clenched, and struck the glowing globe at Sephiroth's waist. The globe cracked, and then shattered. A blast of intense energy fired out from inside, surrounding the summon. Titan roared in pain, and then his voice died out. The burning energy surrounded Sephiroth too, and even his skin was burned by the searing energy. He writhed in pain and folded his arms across his torso. The feathers shimmered and showers of sparkling light began to filter down onto the burned skin. The skin bubbled and began to close, healing itself. Cloud saw this and turned.
Barret, he's healing himself,
he called.
Stop him. You got it,
replied Barret. He raised his gun arm and opened fire. His bullets sank into Sephiroth's arm, but Sephiroth ignored the wounds and continued to work on healing himself. Barret cursed and used his fire materia to add more power to his bullets. The bullets did damage, piercing and burning the flesh of his shoulders. A hand grabbed his shoulder and pulled him around. Barret stopped firing as Sid snatched the fire materia from his gun arm and slotted it into the pull of his spear.
Let me,
he said. The pilot then hoisted his spear, which he had retrieved from where it had fallen, up onto his shoulder, took aim and then threw it. The spear landed in Sephiroth's shoulder. On contact, the fire materia flashed and the spear erupted into flame. The flames spread like wildfire along Sephiroth's shoulders and across his broad torso, damaging the skin faster than his healing magic could fix it. Sephiroth roared and writhed in pain, his wings flailing as he tried to bat out the flames that were spreading quickly along his body.
Not so fast.
Sephiroth looked up and had a sudden sense of déjà vu as he saw Tifa falling down towards him. The fighter kicked a devastating blow to Sephiroth's jaw, sending his head reeling backwards. She grasped Sephiroth's head and drove her knee into his face, before drawing back her fist.
Tifa,
she heard Barret call,
get back now.
Tifa looked down at her feet. A ball of light rose up in front of her, separating her from Sephiroth. It shimmered and began to take form. Tifa stared as the light took on the form of an angel, with small, glowing wings and a cool, calm face. But unlike the angels she had seen in stories, this angel had eyes that were literally made of ice. They glinted as they stared at her, and the angel's calm face split into an evil, heartless smile.
Tifa,
called Cloud.
Get back.
This time she heeded his words and jumped back away from Sephiroth, landing on the platform beside Cloud. The angel spread its arms and then raised them over its head. Numerous fireballs filled the air above them, covering the sky in a blanket of fire. The angel then lowered its arms and the balls rained down onto the battlefield. The companions raised their arms to shield themselves as the fireballs rained down around them. Those that hit the platforms dug deep holes into the rock, incinerating them so that they were black and charred. Cat covered his head with his hands and cried out as Red 13 leaped from podium to podium, dodging the fireballs whilst trying to make his way over to his friends. Through the falling fire he saw Vincent and Barret standing back to back as they fired shots imbued with ice up at the fireballs that fell around them, freezing them and shattering them. To the other side, Cloud swiped his sword, slicing the balls that came within range. Tifa could only dodge, ducking and rolling around the platform, trying not to be hit. Then, something pierced through the fire. It struck Sephiroth squarely in his chest and flung him back into the wall of the Mako pit, pinning him against it. Sephiroth roared in rage as he looked down at the massive spear that penetrated his torso and pinned him to the wall. He looked up at Sid and Odin, standing together on the outer rim. The pilot rubbed his nose and gave Cloud a thumbs up.
There you go. I got him pinned. Now, hurry up and finish the job.
He shouted. Cloud nodded. He turned to Barrett.
Barrett, over here.
He called. Barrett nodded and leaped down onto the lower platform. He ran alongside Cloud to the edge, where he stopped and stretched out his arm. Cloud jumped and landed on his gun arm and then, with Barrett giving him a push, jumped again and soared up towards Sephiroth. Sephiroth was pinned and unable to escape. He raised his wings but did it too late. Cloud zoomed in, swung his blade, and thrust the sword. He struck. The blade sank home. And, in that moment, everyone held their breath. End of chapter. Episode 45, Part 15, Chapter 43. Chapter 43. The silence that followed after Cloud struck was immense. The companions stood still, their eyes fixed on Cloud and Sephiroth. Everything was so quiet and so still it was as though stop had been cast over the battlefield, keeping everything in place. Cloud was standing on Odin's spear, which still pierced Sephiroth's torso. His sword was embedded deeply in Sephiroth's chest, just beneath his heart. Blood trickled thickly down the blade. It reached the hilt and spilled onto Cloud's fingers. A few drops fell and splashed onto the Mako pool far below them, marring the gentle green surface with dots of ugly red. Whatever magic had gripped the field then vanished, as Sephiroth shuddered and coughed. Droplets of blood splashed onto the blade, and Cloud raised his head. Sephiroth was glaring down at him, his face twisted in anger. Blood seeped out of the corners of his mouth. When he coughed, droplets fell and landed on Cloud's face, trickling down his cheeks. Cloud ignored them, gazing up into the eyes of his enemy.
You?
Sephiroth's voice was hoarse.
This is not over yet.
Cloud responded by pushing his sword deeper into Sephiroth's chest, until it was almost at the hilt. Sephiroth coughed again and more blood spilled onto the blade. Numerous drops fell onto the Mako below, forming a reddish cloud. Sephiroth shuddered. Cloud could feel his body weakening. He altered his grip and withdrew the Buster Sword, and then jumped back off the spear to rejoin his friends on the platforms below. They all gathered around him, looking up at Sephiroth. Odin's spear disappeared and Sephiroth sagged heavily. His head slumped onto his chest. He moved away from the wall, moving slowly towards them. Before he could reach the companions, a tremor shook his body and he began to fall. Sephiroth raised his wings, reaching for the companions, but they dropped back to his sides as the strength left them. He fell into the life stream, shattering its smooth surface. He sank, and the Mako closed over him. He was gone. One by one the companions lowered their weapons and began to breathe again. They could not believe it. It was over. The only one who did not lower his weapon was Cloud. He stared down into the Mako pool's shifting surface. No, it was not over yet. Sephiroth had said so himself. The swordsman raised his sword and held it ready, waiting. The surface of the pool started to bubble. It swelled and then burst upwards, sending showers of Mako flying into the air. The Mako began to swirl around them, growing so hot that clouds of steam began to rise off of it. The clouds spread and surrounded the companions, growing so thick that they blotted everything from sight. Tifa turned and watched in alarm as one by one her friends vanished from her sight, swallowed up by the smoke. The ground beneath her feet disappeared, dispersing into the clouds, leaving her with the feeling that she was standing on the clouds themselves.
Cloud!
She called, trying to find him through the smoke.
What the hell's happening?
That was Sid's voice, coming from behind her.
This is Sephiroth's doing.
Red 13's voice spoke from somewhere beside her.
What?
Exclaimed Yuffie.
You mean he's not dead yet? That blow should have fucking killed him.
That, obviously, came from Barrett.
Humph,
grunted Vincent. He didn't seem too surprised.
This is Sephiroth you're talking about,
Kat said.
You didn't think he'd go down as easy as that, did you?
Cloud gripped his sword tightly.
Show yourself, Sephiroth.
He called to the clouds. As you wish. The clouds lifted, and the companions saw that once again the scenery around them had changed. When they could see each other again, the 8 friends drew together and stood in a wide circle, facing outwards, examining their new surroundings. They stood at the center of the twirling heavens, a landscape of Sephiroth's own devising, chosen specially for this final confrontation. Dozens of white clouds swirled around them, stretching endlessly into the distance. When they looked down, they saw that there was no ground beneath their feet, they stood on the air itself. An unknown source of light shone around them, filling the battlefield with light. Above them the clouds parted. The companions looked up and their mouths opened wide in awe as Sephiroth emerged from the parting clouds, descending upon them. Once again Sephiroth's form had changed. From the waist up, he was human mostly with his chest bare and muscled, his arms spread out. His left arm was normal with the palm facing upwards, but his right arm had been replaced by a long purple-black wing with feathers that were as sharp and deadly as blades. Sephiroth's face was cold and impassive, betraying no emotion. His long silver hair trailed above him, shimmering as the bright light of the heavens passed over it. Behind his shoulders and head were two large golden halos that shone brightly with untold energy, twirling slowly. From the waist down all semblance of humanity disappeared, as his legs were replaced with 6 great white wings. These wings, with their purple-tipped feathers, beat slowly as Sephiroth floated down and hovered before the companions. The companions stood together, unwavering, their weapons ready in their hands. Sephiroth's eyes passed over them, unblinking.
Sephiroth!
Called Cloud. He stepped forward. His footsteps made the air around him ripple, as though he were walking on water. Cloud stopped in front of Sephiroth. He raised his sword.
This ends here. We won't let you destroy the planet.
Sephiroth looked down at him. His lips twisted into a smile.
Come and try,
he said. Cloud accepted the challenge. He charged. Sephiroth raised his winged arm and brought it down in front of him. The wing blade cut right through the air. They could hear it being ripped apart and sent a powerful gust of wind and energy hurtling towards Cloud. Cloud swung his sword and cut through the energy, splitting it in two. He swung his sword again, and the blade clashed against Sephiroth's wing. There was a flash as the two connected, and tendrils of white energy tapered off around them. Cloud drew his sword and struck again. Sephiroth, too, swung his arm. The two weapons clashed and more white sparks danced around them. Sephiroth's wing blade was harder than steel, and the strength put into each strike was immense. Cloud returned each of Sephiroth's blows with a strike of his own, fighting back with equal strength and determination. Gradually he began to push Sephiroth back. The Buster sword clanged against the wing blade. Sephiroth grunted and pulled back away from Cloud, his face dark. He raised his hand and a ball of dark energy formed around it. When Cloud saw it he jumped back out of the way. Sephiroth grinned and threw the ball down at Cloud's feet. The ball expanded, tripling in size. It pulled Cloud in, and he cried out as the shock of Demi tried to tear his body apart. Tifa gasped. She turned to her friends.
Come on,
she said, and ran in to join the final battle for the planet. Her friends looked at each other, nodded, and then followed her into battle. Sephiroth looked up, saw the companions heading towards him. With a wave of his hand he cast Cloud away and turned to face them. He gestured with his hand, daring them to come. Still he mocked them and made light of their strength. Barret and Vincent stopped and stood side by side as they fired a stream of bullets through the air. Seeing the volley approach, Sephiroth held out his hand, palm open, in front of him. A wall of energy rose up in front of him and blocked the bullets, which bounced off with a clang. While the two gunmen fired their weapons, Ifrit came thundering past them, charging on all fours towards Sephiroth. The beast then stopped and leaped into the air. Flames swept over his fist like a glove, making his already powerful arm much more deadly. The beast roared loudly and then brought his fist crashing down on Sephiroth's barrier, intending to smash it to pieces. The barrier gave a jolt and a long crack formed in its translucent surface, but it remained in place, protecting Sephiroth from harm. Ifrit landed in front of the calamity and raised his fist once more, this time preparing to smash the barrier completely. Moving so fast the eye could barely see it, Sephiroth lowered his barrier and swung his wing blade. Ifrit scrabbled as he was swept up off the floor, and with another wave of his arm Sephiroth sent him flying through the air. He sailed over Barret and Vincent, and Barret paused in his volley long enough to watch Ifrit fly overhead.
Barret!
Called Vincent. Barret turned back. His eyes widened as he saw Sephiroth surging towards him, moving at astonishing speed. Before Barret could even think about moving away, Sephiroth was upon him, his wing blade raised and ready to strike. The wing came down and Barret closed his eyes tight. There was a loud clash followed by a flash of light. Barret slowly opened his eyes. Cloud was standing in front of him, the Buster sword raised level over his head. The wing blade rested heavily against the sword, blocked by the sword. Cloud glanced over his shoulder.
Hurry!
He said through gritted teeth.
Move!
The former resistance leader did as he was told and jumped back. He raised his gun arm and fired. Sephiroth instantly raised his barrier, blocking the bullets just in time. Sephiroth ignored Barret and looked down at Cloud still standing in front of him, blocking Sephiroth's swing with his sword.
You,
Sephiroth said in his deep, calm voice,
are becoming a nuisance.
He smiled.
Why not go back to being a puppet and let me pull your strings some more?
Cloud cursed.
Never.
He said, and pushed on his sword. Little by little, the wing blade was pushed back, succumbing to Cloud's greater will. Sephiroth's eyes narrowed. He raised his hand. Sparks of energy formed around it and were drawn into the center of his palm. His hand glowed, and a beam of blue energy came shooting out. Cloud lowered his sword and dived out of the way, feeling the heat of the beam as it sailed narrowly past him. The swordsman hit the floor and rolled back onto his feet. He held his sword out in front of him, ready to attack. Sephiroth moved after him. There was a flash of light and something suddenly zipped past his face. Sephiroth halted. Something trickled down his cheek. Sephiroth reached up and touched his face, stared at the blood that was on his fingertips. The Calamity's brow creased in almost uncontrollable anger. There was a second flash of movement, but this time Sephiroth was ready for it as he reached out and snatched the object out of the air. He looked down at the object. It was a shuriken. Sephiroth looked behind him and saw Yuffie standing at a safe distance with a surprised look on her face, startled that he had caught her weapon so easily. Sephiroth waved his hand and hurled the shuriken right back at her. Yuffie nimbly leaped out of the way and, while she was in mid-flip, Sephiroth fired another beam of pale blue light. The ninja saw the beam coming but was unable to dodge it in time. She braced herself for the end. Out of nowhere, a wall of water rose up in front of her. The beam struck the water and exploded into a shower of light. The wall held firm, steam rising as the heat of the beam surged through it. Behind the wall Yuffie stared in wonder as the water wall glowed brightly. A shadow fell behind her and she turned, smiling in relief as she saw Leviathan settle down behind her. The serpent hissed, putting all its energy into the wall, protecting his summoner. Sephiroth closed his palm and the beam ceased. Catching movement in the corner of his eye, he swerved easily to the side, missing Cloud's attempt to catch him off guard. Behind Cloud, Sid threw his spear, and with a wave of his wing blade Sephiroth sent the weapon flying back, along with Cloud and Sid. Sephiroth smiled in sadistic pleasure as the two men crashed and rolled along the floor. Then something large and heavy slammed into his back, knocking the wind out of him. The Calamity stumbled forward. His wings crumpled beneath him and he fell down onto the floor. Titan stood over him. Red 13 stood on the Titan's broad shoulder, with Cat Shi sitting safely on his back. With a word from Cat, the Titan raised his fists above his head, preparing to end it all in one powerful blow. But Sephiroth was far from finished. With a beat of his wings, he moved out of the way of Titan's fists as they slammed uselessly into the ground. Red 13 ordered Titan to follow him, but Sephiroth was already up off the ground and rising high up into the air. The Calamity stopped and hovered in the air above them. He crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes. Light swept throughout the twirling heavens, burning so brightly that it blotted out the clouds and the sky. The companions looked around in alarm as everything around them vanished, swallowed up by the white light. Dark shadows fell over their bodies, in contrast to the light. Then it hit them. 100 balls of bursting black energy burst out of the light and swamped the battlefield. The balls surrounded the companions and summons, contracted and then exploded in a shower of dark light. They screamed as the light whipped their bodies, cutting through clothing and flesh. On Titan's shoulder, Red 13 howled and writhed in pain. Cat lost his grip and fell from the hound's back, tumbling down onto the ground below. Seconds later Red 13 fell down beside him, no longer able to maintain his grip. Just as suddenly as it had hit, the light vanished. The companions all sagged and dropped to their knees, gasping for breath. The effects of the dark light were evident on their bodies, cuts and slashes covered their skin, and blood trickled from the wounds. Even Yuffie, with Leviathan wound protectively around her, had not escaped the onslaught. She clung to the serpent, also wounded, as blood poured down her arm from a gash in her right shoulder. Cloud rose unsteadily to his feet. His hands were shaking. There was no doubt, Sephiroth was far stronger than he had been before. Bizarro Sephiroth was like a warm-up, a test to see if they truly had what it took to bring Sephiroth down. Now Sephiroth was not holding back. He showed them no mercy. Even fighting as one, Sephiroth was more than a match for them. They had to fight back with everything they had, or they and the planet would die. And that was something he could not allow. A shadow fell over him. Cloud looked up and saw Sephiroth descending before him. The Calamity's 6 white wings beat slowly as he floated down to stand before Cloud. Sephiroth's arms were spread, his cold eyes bore into him.
Why do you keep fighting?
Sephiroth asked him. When Cloud did not respond, the Calamity turned his eyes to the twirling heavens, looking around at the clouds.
The planet is already dying, Cloud. Shinra has been sucking up its life for years. All I'm doing is giving the planet a swift end, putting it out of its misery and returning it to the life stream of the cosmos. But you want to prolong its suffering.
Sephiroth chuckled.
How heartless you are. I'm not going to prolong its suffering,
Cloud responded.
I'm giving the planet a chance to decide its fate for itself. It's not for you to decide when it should die. You think Holy will save you? Holy acts solely on the will of the planet. If the planet wishes it, Holy will erase you and the rest of your kind from existence. Holy and Meteor are both cut from the same cloth. Forever in opposition but born as one. The Cetra's prayer may have called Holy, but her wish is meaningless.
Sephiroth smiled. Cloud recognized that smile. It was the same smile he had worn before he pulled his mass immune out of Aeris's body and watched her fall, lifeless, to the floor. Cloud's hands shook in anger, the same anger he had felt back then. Sephiroth slashed his winged arm, and Cloud jumped back out of its reach. When he landed, a ring of light appeared, and the swordsman leaped back once more as a blast of light erupted from the ring, renting the air. The shockwave caught Cloud and sent him flying, but when he landed he quickly rose back onto his feet and charged forward. He leaped, blade thrust out, aiming to do as he had done with Bizarro Sephiroth and pierce Sephiroth's dark heart, bringing this to a bloody end. Sephiroth beat his wings and rose up, flying out of Cloud's reach. The swordsman sailed past underneath. He landed and watched as Sephiroth rose up into the clouds.
Cloud.
Cloud turned. Tifa was running towards him. Cloud held out his sword and twisted the blade so that it was hanging flat. Tifa jumped and landed on the broadside of the blade. She jumped and Cloud pushed the blade upwards, giving her a boost as she soared up into the air. The fighter reached out and grabbed hold of one of Sephiroth's wings as it came within reach. She yanked hard, pulling herself upwards so that she was level with Sephiroth. Grabbing the Calamity by the shoulder, she pulled him around to face her. Before Sephiroth could defend himself, Tifa clenched her fist and smashed it into Sephiroth's face. There was the painful crunch of bone smashing against bone. Tifa drew back her other fist and struck again. Her diamond studs cut into Sephiroth's skin, staining them with blood.
That was for Nibelheim,
she shouted. Sephiroth swung his wing blade, but the fighter simply swerved her head out of the way. The edge of the blade caught her shoulder, but she ignored the pain and instead punched Sephiroth in his face once more. The Calamity fell back, but Tifa grabbed onto his wrist. She pushed herself upwards so that she was moving over him. He looked up at her.
And this is for my father.
She fell and drop-kicked Sephiroth in the back of his head. Sephiroth's hand was wrenched from her grasp as the Calamity was sent hurtling back towards the ground. He slammed into the invisible ground, separating the clouds that gathered there. The clouds swarmed around him, covering him from view. Tifa landed on the ground seconds later. She looked up at the clouds, panting heavily. Katshi and his Mog walked towards the edge of the mass of clouds.
Did that do it, I wonder?
He asked aloud, tapping his megaphone on his shoulder. Cautiously the cat leaned forward, trying to see Sephiroth through the clouds. A wing shot out of the clouds. It struck the Mog and sent it flying backwards. Cat, meanwhile, watched in horror as Sephiroth rose up out of the clouds. He hovered above the clouds. Cat trembled and fled, retreating to run behind Red 13. Barrett and Vincent opened fire. Sephiroth raised his wall and blocked the bullets. Sid threw his spear and Yuffie hurled her shuriken with all her might. Sephiroth swerved smoothly out of the way of the spear and snatched the shuriken once more out of the air. He closed his fist around it, crushing the conformer. He dropped the crushed weapon onto the floor, and Yuffie gulped. Sephiroth looked around at the 8 companions standing around him.
No more games,
he said. He raised his arms above him. Sid quickly retrieved his spear and then ran to rejoin the others, who were gathering together in front of their enemy. They raised their weapons, bracing themselves for whatever attack Sephiroth was going to throw at them. The sky behind Sephiroth opened up and began to disperse. It was as though Sephiroth had opened a doorway into the heart of the heavens, and the darkness that lay beyond the door was surging through. The bright light of the sky and clouds disappeared, replaced by an impenetrable darkness that encompassed everything. Sephiroth lowered his arms and retreated into the shadows, vanishing from sight. The darkness moved around the companions, who watched in awe as stars began to twinkle in the sky. They were sparse but grew in number until thousands and thousands of stars filled the sky, around them, above them, and below them. It was as though they were standing in space itself. Sid turned on the spot, watching the stars as they twinkled around him. It looked so real. For a moment he almost believed that he had somehow left the planet entirely and had returned to the space that he loved so much.
Is this space?
He asked aloud. His voice echoed around him. Vincent stepped forward. His footsteps caused the endless space to ripple like water.
No.
He answered gruffly. His eyes scanned the heavens, taking it all in.
This is just an illusion to catch us off guard. Don't be fooled by it. Pretty realistic looking for an illusion,
commented Yuffie. She looked down at one of the distant nebulas, with a dark green hue, hovering silently beneath her. It sent a shiver down Yuffie's spine. It really did look as though they were in space. A flash of light appeared ahead, and the companions looked to the space before them. A summoning circle appeared, with numerous symbols and words written in a language they could not understand. The outer rim of the circle turned clockwise like a clock ticking away time. The circle then stopped ticking and glowed brightly. A speck of light appeared in the distance. It grew closer and closer, moving at great speed, heading towards the companions. It was a glacial comet, called forth by the summoning circle. The comet was encased in a thick, rugged layer of ice and had a long tail running behind it. The tail was also made of ice, caught in the comet's gravitational pull. The comet passed by the companions, so close they could see its crystalline surface, and the thousands of tiny rocks of ice caught in its tail. The comet plowed through space, following an unseen trail. It approached one of the nearby galaxies and passed through one of its long, curving tails. It picked up speed as it powered its way forward, bypassing the many stars and planets that called this galaxy their home. It approached one solar system in particular, a solar system with a single young sun and 8 orbiting planets. The comet approached Pluto, the outermost planetoid at the farthest reaches of the solar system. The planetoid was moving slowly, following its long and distant orbit around the sun. Its surface, like the comet, was encased in a thick layer of dark ice. The comet crashed into Pluto. With the comet's size and speed, the tiny planetoid stood no chance. It was smashed into pieces, its icy surface shattering. Giant chunks of rock fired off from the point of impact and went spiraling into space. What remained of the broken planetoid began to drift steadily out of orbit, leaving the solar systems behind. The comet left the remains of Pluto behind and headed on towards Saturn. Thankfully the comet missed Saturn and instead passed through one of the planet's surrounding rings. It smashed its way through the ring, and any asteroids that were unfortunate enough to be in its path were completely destroyed on impact as the comet powered its way through. The remaining asteroids, caught in its wake, glowed hotly and then exploded. The explosions spread like wildfire throughout Saturn's rings, giving them a visible glow that would be visible from light years away. The next planet to suffer the comet's wrath was Jupiter. Since the giant planet was made up entirely of compressed gases, there was nothing to offer resistance as the comet pushed its way through. The many gases separated and were forced outward as the comet slipped through. The comet passed straight through with ease, leaving a large, gaping hole in Jupiter's body. As with Saturn's rings, the gases within Jupiter ignited, causing a lethal chain reaction that nothing could stop. The planet glowed and exploded, sending shockwaves rippling throughout the system. The comet meanwhile, continued onwards. It was heading towards the sun at the very center of the solar system. The comet was moving so fast that the ice on its surface had barely begun to melt before the comet crashed into the sun and disappeared beneath its hot, fiery surface. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a violent shudder shook the sun from deep within, and the sun began to change. Bubbles began to rise and pop across its surface as millions and millions of explosions were set off all at once, rupturing it from the inside. The sun began to expand, almost doubling in size in a matter of seconds. It swelled like an overfilled balloon before it suddenly contracted into a tight ball, and then exploded. The sun had gone supernova. The comet had caused a complete collapse in the sun's core, causing it to expel all its energy in one violent, devastating blast. Now the sun was expanding at a rapid rate, growing in strength. The light it emitted was so bright and so fierce it was impossible to comprehend. Mercury was the first planet to be affected by the supernova. As the sun's giant body drew near, the planet's surface sizzled and turned black as everything on it was burned to a cinder by the extreme heat. A tendril of flame licked out from the sun's surface and brushed over the dead planet. At its touch, the planet crumbled, breaking into tiny dust particles that were quickly swept away by the flames. The sun then reached Venus, and it, too, was burned to a crisp. The planet's yellow surface turned dark as the acidic storm clouds that swamped the entire planet were burned away, leaving the surface bare. The edge of the sun touched the dead surface, and Venus disintegrated in a flash. The 8 companions watched in awe as the exploding star headed towards them. The sun was so unbelievably large it filled every ounce of their vision. An endless sea of flames that was ever growing, never ending. It threatened to overturn their minds and drive them to the brink of insanity. They were so small and insignificant compared to this. And the heat? Red 13 stepped back away from the others. His legs were shaking and threatening to give way beneath him. He closed his eyes, but the light burned right through his lids. He shook his head, trying to shake the image out of his mind. Nonetheless, it stayed. Eventually, the hound became so desperate to get the light out of his mind that he turned away, wanting to run until the light could not find him anymore. He turned, opened his eyes, and then froze in fear. Red 13 turned back.
"Cloud!"
he called. Cloud and the others turned. Their eyes widened. Their planet was right behind them. The sun was fast approaching, and already they could see the effects the growing sun was having on the planet. The atmosphere glowed red-hot as it swiftly burned away, leaving the planet defenseless against the sun's rays. Through the rapidly evaporating clouds they saw the oceans boil over and dry up. The vast plains of green land grew as withered and dark as the lands where the life stream had already dried up. Fires swept over the planet's surface. Through it all, they could hear the planet screaming in pain and anguish as its life was burned away. The companions turned their backs on the planet and faced the oncoming sun. At some point Sephiroth had emerged from the darkness and was now hovering in front of the star. He had a dark smile on his face as the flames of the sun reached forward like deadly fingers and wrapped themselves around his body, drawing him back into the flames. There he hovered, his wings ablaze as he beat them slowly. His arms were spread wide. The flames danced along his silver hair, which burned red. Cloud closed his eyes. Vincent was right. All of this, the growing sun, the burning, withering plants, it was all just an illusion. Sephiroth had created this to sap their will, filling their minds with visions of what would become of them and the planet. But despite all of Sephiroth's efforts, an illusion is all that it was. And Cloud would not be controlled by an illusion. He had to focus only on what was real. Cloud raised his sword and pressed the blade against his forehead. The blade was cool against his skin. The swordsman gripped the edge tightly, feeling the metal cut dig into his skin through his gloves. Yes. The cool blade, the pain he felt when he gripped the blade. This was real. This was something he could grasp with his hands and control. Sephiroth's illusion was nothing. Cloud opened his eyes and gazed defiantly into the light of the sun. Already the light seemed to have grown weaker, he could look into it clearly. The flames that were now only meters away hesitated, as though realizing that Cloud had broken free of its spell. Cloud lowered his blade and held it ready in his hands.
"Everyone, wake up!"
he ordered.
"It's time we finished this."
The sound of his voice woke the others from their thrall. One by one they snapped out of it and came forward to stand beside Cloud, their weapons at the ready. The summons, Leviathan, Titan and Ifrit, returned to the materia, adding their strength to the companions' weapons. Cloud walked forward. His footsteps rippled on the star-studded ground. The swordsman walked right up to the wall of flames and stopped a few feet from it. The star had ceased growing. He could feel its intense heat against his skin. One long wisp of flame flicked out and lashed his skin, but Cloud ignored it. Sephiroth was still hovering amongst the flames, his arms spread wide. As long as Sephiroth was enveloped in the flames of his spell, he could not cast anything else. If they wanted to end it, then this was their chance. Cloud raised his sword and charged. The others ran with him. They burst through the sun's barrier and charged through the flames. The heat was scorching, the light overwhelming, but they did not slow down. They kept on running, heading towards Sephiroth. Barret and Vincent fired, and Sephiroth raised his right wing to shield his face and torso from the bullets. The rounds bounced off the wing, and while Sephiroth was busy shielding his face, the two gunmen shifted their aim to below Sephiroth's waist. The bullets tore through the flapping wings, sending feathers flying. Sephiroth cried out and raised his wing. A shuriken flew through the air. It clashed against the wing as it started to come down and knocked it off course. The blade slashed through the flames instead, slicing through them and causing them to dissipate. Red 13 darted forward. He leaped over the wing and ran behind Sephiroth's back. Sephiroth, surprised, started to turn, but Red 13 was still on the move. The hound ran to one of Sephiroth's long, bleeding wings and closed his teeth around it. He tugged the wing taut, holding it in place. Above him, Sephiroth glared at Red 13 in fury. He was about to turn and knock the bothersome hound aside when he felt a sharp pain in one of his other wings. The Calamity turned and his eyes widened as he saw Sid pull on his spear, dragging the wing he had just pierced towards him. The spear had gone all the way through the wing and now Sid was pulling it towards him, keeping it and Sephiroth from moving. Tifa ran and joined Sid. She grabbed hold of another of Sephiroth's wings as it came sweeping past, pulling it straight with all her strength. Kat ran over to Red 13 and did the same, catching hold of the other wing. The Mach helped, too, gripping the wing in its large, flat hands. Now 4 of Sephiroth's 6 wings were trapped, and the Calamity was unable to escape them. That left only Cloud. The swordsman called on every single piece of materia he had and passed that energy into his sword, giving it additional strength. The blade began to glow brightly. Cloud drew back his sword and leaped up at Sephiroth. He swung the blade. The blade hit, and on contact all the energy that had been stored up in the blade was released. It smashed through Sephiroth's body, ripping him apart from the inside. In an instant the glaring sun disappeared, as did the planet and the vastness of space. The twirling heavens returned, the spell broken. Cloud withdrew his blade and stepped back away from Sephiroth. Tifa and the others released the wings and also stepped back. The companions gathered, looking up at Sephiroth. Sephiroth was hovering before them, his body frozen and still. The clouds behind him came close together and lightning flashed, followed by a deep roll of thunder. A strong breeze began to blow. The companions raised their arms to shield their eyes as more lightning flashed, blinding them. Sephiroth began to move back away from them, being drawn back by the pull of the wind. Sparks of light began to dance over his frozen body, covering him from his head down to his wingtips. The 2 halos behind his head grew dark, their light gone, and as the companions watched they crumbled and dissolved into dust. The wind caught them and pulled them back into the clouds. Sephiroth's body, too, began to dissolve. Starting from the top of his head, his silver hair shimmered and disintegrated. His wings and arms were next, followed by his head and torso. Sephiroth's eyes glared coldly at the companions, and his smile widened, almost in delight. Then the rest of the face dissipated, followed by the rest of the Calamity's body, and Sephiroth was no more. The particles of dust that remained were caught on the wind. The companions watched as these particles went swirling into the flashing clouds, vanishing from view. Sephiroth was finally gone. End of chapter. Episode 46, Part 15, Chapter 44. Chapter 44. Cloud knelt down at the edge of the Mako pit. He looked down the walls at the calmly glowing Mako pit far below them. He watched as the platforms they had used to get down to the bottom crumble and fall into the pool, along with the scattered remains of the podium where they had fought Genova. There was no trace of the Calamity or her son. Both were finally gone. Following Sephiroth's demise, a fierce storm had ripped through the twirling heavens. The high winds had lifted the companions off their feet and carried them through the clouds, until a bright light had appeared and snatched them away. The twirling heavens had vanished from their sight, and when the light finally faded they had found themselves back here, safe and unharmed. Cloud watched as the last of the platforms splashed into the Mako and sank from view. He could hardly believe it. Sephiroth was finally defeated. Yet he thought that he would feel different, somehow. Relieved, or elated. Instead he felt nothing. He knew the reason why. Like the northern crater damaged centuries ago by another catastrophic disaster, the hole that Sephiroth had made deep inside would take a long time to heal. Sephiroth was gone, but the damage was already done. Still.
This is all we could do,
the swordsman said, rising to his feet. It was time to go.
Wait.
Barret interrupted. Cloud looked at him over his shoulder.
What about Holy?
Barret asked him.
What's gonna happen to the planet?
Cloud sighed and folded his arms across his chest. He tapped his foot.
That? I don't know,
he answered finally. He shrugged.
Isn't the rest up to the planet?
The planet? Holy acted on the planet's will. With Sephiroth dead and gone, everything else was for the planet to decide. Were their efforts enough to make the planet decide to save humanity? Any moment from now, Holy would begin to move and they would have their answer. The companions thought this over, and one by one they nodded in agreement.
You're right,
said Tifa.
We've done all that we could do.
Cloud looked around at his friends. They were all tired and weary, worn out from the long battles. Yet they had all managed to survive.
All right, everyone.
Cloud clapped his hands to draw everyone's attention. His friends turned to him.
It's no use thinking about it. We'll leave all our worries here. Let's go home proud.
The companions looked at one another. Cloud was right. Whether the planet chose to eliminate them or not, at least they had done what they had set out to do. Defeat Sephiroth and release Holy from its captivity. From here on out, everything that was left was up to the planet. Their job was over. Sid reached behind his goggles and pulled out a welcome victory cigarette from his nearly empty pack. He put it to his lips, lit it, and took a long drag. He exhaled with a content sigh, and then he heaved his spear up onto his shoulder. He then walked along the winding path, leading Barret and the others out. The monsters that had swarmed the crater walls were gone, leaving the path clear. Cloud and Tifa were the last to leave. Tifa took a moment to look at Cloud. She knew what he was thinking. She felt the same. Sephiroth had been a major part of her life, too. Because of him, she had lost her home and her father, and had nearly lost herself in the process. Yet here she was now. In the end, Sephiroth could not take away everyone that was precious to her. Cloud and the rest of her friends were still with her. For that, at least, Tifa was thankful. She smiled at Cloud, and then turned and walked after the others. Cloud started to go after her. Just as he stepped forward, a sharp piercing pain shot through his mind, like an electric shock. Cloud stopped and touched his forehead. Tifa, realizing that Cloud had stopped, turned to him.
What happened?
She asked him. Cloud looked down at the ground. His head was buzzing.
I feel it,
he said. Tifa tilted her head, confused.
What?
Ha, ha, ha. Another flash of pain shot through Cloud's mind. The swordsman blinked. He put his hand to his head and shook it. He knew this feeling only too well. And that voice? No, it couldn't possibly. His heart started to race.
He is still here.
Ha, ha, ha. Once again, Cloud felt that painful buzz running through his mind. It was growing in strength. Cloud put his hands to his head.
Still.
His legs buckled and he dropped to his knees. Still the pain was growing. That strange voice was echoing throughout his mind. Cloud writhed, trying to shake the sound from his head.
Cloud.
It was Tifa's voice, calling out to him. Her voice echoed faintly inside his head, drowned out by the pain and the strange, booming laughter.
He's laughing.
His vision blurred, and the ground started to spin. Cloud closed his eyes. He felt himself rising up off the ground and into the air. When he opened his eyes, he saw Tifa on the path below, running towards him. For his body was still there below him. Cloud closed his eyes again as his spirit turned towards the Mako pool and started to descend.
Cloud.
But Cloud could no longer hear her. The Mako pool surged up to meet him and he landed with a splash. Cool warmth passed over Cloud's skin as he sank. His face burned hot with a familiar fever, which then swiftly passed and left him feeling cool and calm. Cloud released his head and let his arms fall to his sides. He relaxed his body, letting himself sink deeper into the Mako. As he sank further and further into the heart of the planet, old memories started to resurface. Familiar sounds, like the loud and cheerful music of Gold Saucer, echoed around him. The crash of the waves as they broke on the shores of Costa del Solution. The heavy metal scent of Midgar drifted past him, followed by the horrible sounds of screams as the Sector 7 plate dropped down on the innocent people below. Before Cloud's eyes, an image came to him. He was deep underwater, with bubbles of white light rising around him. High above the water, he could see Meteor hovering close to the planet. Close. Too close. When did Meteor get so close? Had Sephiroth done something to draw Meteor closer? Cloud's brows drew together. Was this a vision from the planet, warning him? Cloud turned away from Meteor and began to descend deeper into the water. Darkness closed around him, and voices began to echo through his mind. He heard the voices of his friends, and the voices of Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse. The voices of Reno and Rude, Feng and Elena. And behind them all there was a small, unknown voice. It was the voice of the planet. The planet was crying out to Cloud. It was in pain and terribly afraid. Afraid of the giant soulless steel body that was heading towards it, afraid of the terrifying being that lived inside it, threatening to take its life. Holy. The planet could not fend off Meteor without it, and it could not use Holy until Sephiroth was gone. Though the planet's words were impossible to understand, their meaning was clear. Help me. I'll help you, Cloud thought as he fell deeper into the planet. Just take me to him. In an instant the voices ceased. A light appeared ahead. Cloud raised his head and opened his eyes. He looked ahead. Sephiroth was there, standing at the very heart of the planet. He was back in his human form and now he stood, bare-chested, with his long silver hair blowing gently around him. He held his sword, the Masamune, in his left hand ready. Sephiroth raised his eyes. When he saw Cloud coming towards him, his glowing eyes widened, the pupils narrowed. Sephiroth smiled coldly. Cloud gazed back at Sephiroth. His own eyes glowing with the same, Mako-infused light hardened. Whether the planet chose to spare humanity or not, he would at least do the planet a favor and rid it of Sephiroth once and for all. The unknown hand that had been guiding Cloud up to this point then released its hold on him, and Cloud floated down onto the dark platform. The two men faced each other, staring closely at one another.
So, Cloud?
Sephiroth said, his voice piercing the calmness of the planet's heart.
Here we are. Here we are,
agreed Cloud. Sephiroth's smile widened. He walked slowly around Cloud in a wide circle, keeping his distance. His leather creaked loudly as he moved. His fingers flexed around the hilt of the Masamune, finding a more comfortable grip. Cloud watched Sephiroth's every move, his body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Sephiroth's arm muscles tightened and then relaxed.
You've come a long way since Nibelheim. Thanks. Forgive me if I don't return the compliment.
Sephiroth stopped. He turned to face Cloud.
So tell me,
he began.
How do you think you'll fare now that you're on your own? Without your friends to help you?
Cloud closed his eyes. In his mind's eye he saw his friends, standing together on the bridge of the High Wind. They were all there, waiting for him to come back.
Alone?
Cloud shook his head.
No. As long as there are people out there that I can protect, then I am never alone.
The swordsman reached behind him and drew the Buster sword.
Unlike you. You have no one.
Sephiroth raised an eyebrow. He walked around Cloud once more and then stopped in front of him. He changed his stance, raised his sword above his head. The Masamune's blade flashed brightly.
Let's get this over with,
Sephiroth said. Cloud raised his sword. The two men stood facing each other. They looked deep into each other's eyes with unwavering determination. The tension grew between them, bearing down upon them, as they continued to stare fiercely at one another, waiting for the other to make a move. Cloud made his move first. He charged at Sephiroth.
Captain? I'm the captain. The name's Sid. Everyone calls me captain though. What do you want? I was with the Shinra Manufacturing Department in Administrative Research, the Turks. Vincent.
Cloud could hear them, the words of his friends. He could feel their presence with him, and their strength. He drew back his blade. Across from him, Sephiroth also charged, darting across the shadows of the planet's heart.
How about it? Want me to read your fortune? A bright future. A happy future. Oh, but don't hold it against me if it's not a good prediction. Oh, so sorry. I'm a fortune-telling machine. The name's catchy. Hey. 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 Wait. I haven't even told you my name. I'm Yuffie. Good to meet ya.
Sephiroth drew back his own blade. He smiled as he ran and raised his mass immune high. The long silver blade flashed brightly as he ran forward, eager to bring this confrontation to a swift and bloody end.
Hojo has named me Red 13. A name with no meaning whatsoever to me. Call me whatever you wish. Ex-soldier, hey? Don't trust ya.
Cloud gave a loud cry. The materia in his gauntlets glowed, passing their energy down Cloud's hands and into the blade. There was a loud roar as 3 Bahamut dragons also gave their energy to Cloud, passing their strength into his blade.
Welcome home, Cloud. Looks like everything went well. Did you fight with Barret?
The two men drew close.
Cloud. I'm searching for you. I want to meet you. But I'm right here. I know. What I mean is, I want to meet you.
Cloud swung his sword. At the same time Sephiroth moved, swinging his own sword, bringing it down to meet Cloud's head-on. The two swords clashed. As the blades connected, sparks of light danced along them and into the air around the two swordsmen. Cloud gave another yell and pushed on his sword. Sephiroth pushed back, and then his eyes widened in surprise as the mass immune was suddenly wrenched from his hands. The blade went flying through the air and out of his reach. Cloud did not hesitate. He darted forward, breaking through Sephiroth's defenses, and swung his sword. The Buster Sword glowed as he struck, landing blows again and again without pause or respite. Sephiroth cried out as each blow hit home, unable to defend himself from Cloud's attack. For the final blow, Cloud leaped into the air and raised his sword above his head. The tip glowed brightly as all the energy within the blade gathered at that one point. Cloud descended and brought the blade crashing down upon Sephiroth. Sephiroth stepped back, moving shakily and clutching at his wounded chest. Blood poured down his face and chest, spilling through his closed fingers and dripping onto the floor. Sephiroth coughed, and the movement caused him to drop his mass immune, which clattered onto the floor. Sephiroth took a deep, shaky breath and slowly raised his head. He looked at Cloud, standing before him. And he smiled. Then, suddenly, Sephiroth's smile vanished. His mouth fell open, and his eyes widened in fear and surprise. A deep, burning sensation spread throughout his body like wildfire, as though he was burning from the inside. Beams of light burst out of his waist and torso. The Calamity tried to move, but the inner burning had left him completely immobile and defenseless. The beams spread along his arms and legs, until Sephiroth's entire body was aglow with a piercing, blinding light. Tiny crimson balls of energy Sephiroth's own life force emerged from within him. More and more drifted out and Sephiroth's body grew smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left of him. The light disappeared, and Sephiroth was finally gone. Cloud watched in silence as the balls of red energy drifted through the air above him. Sephiroth's last remnants. A gentle green light began to glow around him. Cloud's eyes were drawn downwards as a spiral of pale green energy rose up out of the ground at his feet. The tendril wound itself loosely around Cloud, offering thanks. It radiated a soothing warmth that eased the pain of his injuries, the only way it could express its gratitude. The tendril then moved upwards and headed towards the red energy still drifting above him. More tendrils followed it, and they gathered around the red energy. Both lights were drawn together, forming a single ball of shimmering energy. The ball then exploded outwards and the tendrils emerged once more. All traces of the red energy were gone, eradicated from existence. With the red energy gone, the tendrils drifted upwards. Cloud watched as they weaved through the air, passing over each other. The swordsman's eyes widened as it finally dawned on him just what the green tendrils really were.
Lifestream.
The lifestream, the life source of the planet and everything on it. Cloud remembered Bugenhagen's words well. Everything that lived was born from the lifestream, and when their lives reached their end they returned to the lifestream, rejoining the endless river. Sephiroth had also been born from the lifestream, and so when he had been defeated, the lifestream had come to take his life energy back. Cloud continued to watch the wispy tendrils of the lifestream. They converged at a point above him, forming a large globe of light. Something began to emerge from within it and Cloud's mouth fell open, unable to believe his eyes. It was a hand, a familiar hand, for he recognized the bracelets dangling around the wrists reaching out to him. Instinctively Cloud reached up to the light, ready to take that hand and let it lead him home. The ground suddenly started to shake, and in a flash Cloud found himself back in the Mako pit, on one of the remaining floating platforms. The life stream, the light, and the hand were all gone. Around him the Mako pit was shaking violently, as a powerful quake rumbled from deep within the planet. Tifa was right above him, leaning over the edge of the path. She was shouting his name, calling for him to reach her. Cloud looked around him. The Mako pool was rising rapidly and was already no more than a few meters beneath him. Cloud inched his way forward on the shaking platform. He tried to reach for Tifa, but she was well out of his reach. The platform he was standing on gave a sudden lurch and split into two. Cloud dropped his hand and staggered, almost thrown from the platform as one of the now two halves began to slip down towards the rising pool. When she saw Cloud stagger, Tifa cried out and leaned further over the edge of the path. A crack appeared in the crater wall beneath where Tifa was kneeling. It spread quickly until it reached the path and a chunk of the rock fell away, taking Tifa with it. She fell head first, heading towards the rocks. Cloud had to move quickly. Ignoring his own plight he darted forward, leaping over the crumbling rock even as it fell away beneath him. He caught Tifa as she fell and then made a break for the overhead path. He jumped and his fingers grabbed onto the edge, just as the rock smashed into the ground. The collision caused the ground to crumble and fall into the Mako pool, landing with a splash. Cloud clung to the edge of the path. Tifa had her arms wrapped tightly around his chest, holding onto him. The two dangled over the Mako pool.
I think I'm beginning to understand,
Cloud said suddenly. Tifa looked up.
What?
She asked him. The swordsman raised his head and looked up to the top of the crater, barely visible through the clouds of dirt shaken from the crater walls. Another tremor shook the crater, and a chunk of rock fell from above and splashed into the pool.
An answer from the planet,
Cloud said. He looked down now, into the glowing Mako pool below him and Tifa.
The promised land. I think I can meet her. There.
Eris. Tifa's eyes filled. She smiled softly, laid her head against his chest.
Yeah, let's go meet her,
she whispered. Beneath them, the Mako pool shimmered as something moved beneath its surface. It glowed hotly for a brief moment before returning to its calm state. Cloud turned his attention back to the ledge. He pulled himself and Tifa up to the ledge. When they were close enough, Cloud gave Tifa a push onto the ledge. The fighter pulled herself up and then turned to help Cloud. He took her hand and she pulled him up onto the ledge beside her. Cloud looked around him.
Hey, where is everyone?
He asked Tifa. Cloud and Tifa looked across the pit. Barrett and the others were on the other side, sitting on the path, safe and sound. Barrett raised his arm over his head. Tifa waved at them.
I'm glad you're all safe,
she called. Seeing Tifa's energetic wave, Barrett sighed and sat back on the rock.
They seem to be safe, too,
he said to Sid. The pilot, next to him, silently nodded his head. Barrett looked down at the pit, where the Mako pool was continuing to rise.
But,
he continued,
now what are we going to do?
A loud rumble sounded from deep beneath the earth. Somewhere at the bottom of the pit, something was beginning to give way. Yuffie leaned over the edge of the path and looked down into the Mako. It was impossible to see anything beneath its shifting surface. The ninja turned and looked up at Vincent, who shook his head.
Holy should be moving soon,
said Red 13,
and that means this place will.
He let the sentence hang. Everyone knew what would happen if Holy began to move while they were still in the crater. Sid turned his gaze to the sky.
Oh, Lady Luck, don't fail me now,
he prayed. Just as he finished his prayer, the crater began to tremble. Sid's jaw fell open, and his cigarette dropped down onto the floor. It rolled to the end of the path and slipped over the edge. It landed on top of the Mako pool, gave a slight hiss as it went out, and then sank out of sight. Everyone looked up to the top of the crater. A violent tremor began to shake the northern crater down to its very foundations. The tremors grew so strong that they began to tear the crater apart. Chunks of rock broke away from the walls and smashed onto the path, cutting off any hopes of retreat. More rock tumbled from above, followed by a thick, smothering cloud of dirt and rock that descended rapidly down the crater towards them. The 8 companions rose to their feet, bracing themselves for the end. The cloud of dirt suddenly parted and the high wind emerged from above. When the tremors began, a cloud of dust rose up and engulfed the high wind, stalling its engines and causing it to plummet into the crater. Hurriedly, the companions ran out of the way and clung to the crater walls as the airship came crashing down. It slammed into the path and lodged there, still, with dust and rocks falling over it. A bright glow filled the northern crater. The air surrounding the crater began to ripple and waver, growing so hot that the ice on the trees and mountains began to melt. The light grew brighter and brighter and then suddenly burst forth in a wave of intense blue-white energy. It was holy, released at last from its prison at the heart of the planet and bursting to the surface in a powerful wave, sending a shockwave ripping through the forests around the crater. As holy burst out of the earth, the high wind was thrown up and out of the crater. The airship was carried upwards before finally breaking free. It tumbled through the air, unable to right itself. What was worse, Holy's immense power was tearing the airship apart. The jets that powered the airship snapped from the wings and fell towards the ground. The high wind hurtled towards the crater below, unable to do anything to stop itself. Inside the high wind, the companions were being thrown out by the buffeting of the airship. The airship lurched and leaned heavily to one side. Cloud clung onto the main console with one hand, with Tifa holding onto the other, trying to keep them both from falling off their feet. Barrett came sliding past them, narrowly missing Red 13, whose claws were dug into the grated ground. Yuffie tumbled past Cat as he staggered about on his Mog. Vincent pushed himself away from the rails and ran behind Yuffie, catching the ninja before she slammed into the wall. Sid was on his belly, clinging onto a handle attached to the floor. He heard the pained roar of the engines as they fought to steady the airship. He heard the sirens whirring loudly, saw the red flash of the lights.
Shit!
The pilot cursed fervently. He reached up with his free hand, trying to grab hold of the emergency lever that was positioned at ground level by the main console. His fingers brushed the handle and then slipped off. The pilot tried again, and once more his fingers slipped away. He could feel his grip on the handle weakening, and with one fervent push the pilot reached up and grabbed hold of the lever. He pulled it towards him as hard as he possibly could. The airship shuddered and exploded in a large ball of flame just moments before it would have smashed into the outer perimeter of the northern crater. The high wind burst out of the flames. Its shape had changed once again, with two large, flat wings at the sides and a single, powerful jet-powered engine at the back. The newly emerged airship spiraled out of the flames and moved away from the crater, following Holy as it turned in the sky, heading south. Meanwhile, in calm, Marlene was sitting by herself in her room, waiting anxiously for news on her father. Elmira was downstairs in the living room, also waiting. It had been almost 2 days since she and Elmira had been taken from their rooms at Shinra headquarters, and almost a full day since her father had left again. Barrett had promised her that he would be coming home soon, and she believed him. But Marlene was a bright young girl, she knew when something wasn't right. She could see the worry in her father's eyes, and ever since he left she had maintained a silent vigil in her room, waiting for him to come back for her. Her thoughts turned to Eris, the flower girl. Marlene thought about Eris a lot, especially since she learned of her death. It was strange. Anytime Marlene had felt troubled or sad, she thought she felt a hand touch her shoulder. It was a comforting feeling and it reminded Marlene that she was not alone. Her father, Tifa and Cloud, they would all be coming back. She thought of Eris right then, as she prayed for the safety of her father and his friends. Suddenly, Marlene raised her head. She thought she had heard a voice whisper her name.
The flower girl,
she said aloud, recognizing the voice. The voice was coming from outside. Marlene pushed back her chair and ran over to the window. Elmira had left it unlocked. Marlene pushed it open and looked outside. She was met by a strong wind that was blowing fiercely throughout calm. The wind was so strong it almost wrenched the shutters from her hands, and sent her hair whipping about her face. Wispy tendrils of dark red energy had fallen over the calm, giving the rural village a ghastly aura. The air was warm even though it was dark outside, and there was a strange smell being carried on the wind. Marlene turned her eyes westward and looked over at Midgar, her former home. Meteor was there. It had pierced through the atmosphere and was now descending on the planet, with Midgar directly at the point of impact. The flames that had covered its body were gone and Marlene saw in perfect detail the craters that covered its surface. The meteor dwarfed the great city, almost twice its size. When meteor hit Midgar would be crushed, until no trace of it remained. The wispy tendrils that flowed through calm were coming from meteor, converging around Midgar. Forked blue bolts of lightning flashed and rent the air. Fierce whirlwinds rose up from inside Midgar's perimeter and joined with meteor, connecting the two. As Meteor gave them strength, the whirlwinds grew thicker and stronger, and began to ravage the upper plates of the city. Anything that came in their path was destroyed, and there was nothing that was not in their path. There were 8 tornadoes in all, 1 in each of Midgar's 8 sectors, including the ruins of Sector 7. Deadly plates of sharp metal went flying into the air as the tornadoes tore them from the ground, filling the air with lethal shrapnel. The whirlwinds were drawn inwards towards Shinra headquarters and began to tear up the ground outside. The watchtowers and scaffolding supporting the cannon were destroyed as the tornadoes came past. One bolt of blue lightning rose up from the ground at the feet of one of the whirlwinds and struck the main building. It tore mercilessly through the building. When it reached the top, the upper beams gave way. The top floors fell away and crashed into the ground below. The whirlwinds moved back out again. Homes were ripped apart, reduced to rubble. One of the Mako reactors exploded into flames, though the Mako supply had been shut off. The whirlwinds continued their assault on the city. Soon there would be nothing left that resembled Midgar. The whirlwinds would destroy everything, and then Meteor would finish the job by plowing the city into the ground. All of this Marlene watched from her bedroom window, her eyes wide in wonder. Once again, she heard the voice Ares' voice. Marlene leaned out of her window, trying to see where the voice had come from. A light flashed over the horizon, breaking through the night sky, preceding Holy's arrival. Holy appeared and raced forwards, heading towards Midgar and Meteor. The blessed light struck and sliced through the raging whirlwinds, severing their connection to the planet. On contact, Holy flashed brightly, and Marlene had to shield her eyes from the pure light. Holy spread out over Midgar and the surrounding land, covering it in a protective shield. Meteor touched Holy's surface. Both powers shimmered brightly as they exerted their will against one another, fighting to see who would emerge the strongest. Meteor pushed against Holy and, slowly, began to break through. It pierced through Holy's sparkling shield and came out the other side, continuing its descent upon Midgar. The dark red aura returned with devastating fury, bathing the city and the underside of Holy's shield in a sea of red. Red clouds swept through the city, smothering it in deadly smoke. Cloud and his friends watched from the high wind as Holy struck. The airship was flying above Meteor and Holy, keeping at a safe distance. The companions clustered together around the window, peering out. Meteor's intimidating glow spread rapidly across the ground, and they could see the blue lightning start to flash once more. When Barrett saw Meteor begin to break through Holy's defenses, he blinked and turned to his friends.
"Wait a damn minute,"
he said gruffly.
"What about Midgar?"
The resistance leader slammed his fist into the rail.
"We can't let that happen. I had everyone take refuge in the slums," said Kat, "but the way things are now..."
He looked out at the devastated city, barely visible through Holy's light. Kat lowered his head, his ears drooped, and he rubbed his eyes. The plates would provide little protection for those sheltering underneath. Red 13 padded up to stand beside Cloud.
"It's too late for Holy,"
he said. Through the rails he watched as Meteor continued to push itself deeper into Holy's shield. Holy responded by trying to draw its energy around Meteor, gathering its strength at the point of impact. Its efforts were in vain, for Meteor continued to push through.
"Meteor is approaching the planet. Holy is having the opposite effect."
Holy rose up around Meteor's lower half, forming a protective cocoon. Waves of energy spilled down its surface as it was repelled by Meteor. From below, the blue lightning flashed and struck Holy, but Holy persevered and continued to fight against its opposite, trying desperately to keep Meteor from reaching the planet.
"Forget Midgar,"
said Red 13,
"we've gotta worry about the planet now."
Cloud gazed down at the Hound. Red 13 was still watching Holy, his gaze unwavering. He was right. There was no point in worrying what would happen to Midgar now. If Holy could not stop Meteor from landing, then more than Midgar would be destroyed. Everything on the planet would die, and the planet itself would perish along with them. Sid brought the airship around and moved it away from Midgar. They all knew that there was nothing they could do to help the planet now. Stopping Meteor was up to the planet and the planet alone. All that they could do now was watch and wait, and hope that Holy would prevail. Unfortunately, it seemed to be a losing battle. With every second that passed, Meteor drew ever closer to the planet. Holy was growing weaker. Meteor's strength was beginning to overpower it. At any moment now Holy would give way and Meteor would be released in all its fury. Sid tapped his finger against the wheel, keeping the airship at a safe distance from the impact zone. Beside him, Barrett continued to watch out the window. Kat, unable to watch as Meteor drew closer, sat forlornly on the head of his Mog and tapped his megaphone on his lap. Vincent folded his arms across his chest, his eyes fixed on Meteor and Holy. Yuffie knelt on the floor, holding her precious materia in her arms. Cloud turned away from Holy and leaned against the rail. Could Holy really lose? He looked down at Red 13. The hound, feeling Cloud's gaze on him, looked up. Cloud saw hope still burned in Red 13's one good eye. The hound still believed in Holy and in the planet. Cloud brushed the hound's mane with his hand. The swordsman then looked away from the hound and turned to Tifa, standing next to him. Tifa, also, turned to look at him. She was about to say something encouraging, when her eyes suddenly drifted past Cloud, towards Midgar.
What's that?
The companions turned and looked out of the window. Outside of Midgar, some distance away from the impact zone, something was beginning to emerge out of the ground. The dry, cracked soil shifted, and a long, slender green wisp of energy pushed its way up out of the ground. The wisp wavered, the numerous strands of pale green energy that made up its body shimmered. Then the wisp began to make its way southwards, heading towards Midgar. Another wispy tendril pushed its way out of the earth close to the first, and also began to head south. A third tendril followed it and then another. Dozens of them were emerging all at once from the very dark depths of the planet. They moved together, moving in gentle waves. The companions all leaned against the rails, watching as dozens more wisps of energy rose out of the planet's surface. The dark and withered land was quickly covered in lines of pale green light that wove and wound around each other to form even larger tendrils of pulsing energy. More tendrils began to rise to the west of Midgar and to the east, and then finally from the south. They just kept on appearing, more and more of them, seemingly endless.
What the hell is that?
Asked Barrett. He looked at Cloud. Cloud did not take his eyes away from the window, his gaze fixed on the tendrils as they wound their way towards the airship.
Livestream,
he said simply. Barrett stared at him, and then slowly turned back to the window. So this was the livestream. Barrett was not a sentimental man or a philosophical one, but it touched him in a very deep place in his heart to think that the planet would resort to this, to use its own life energy in the fight against Meteor. He watched the tendrils as they moved onwards towards Midgar. In calm, the villagers opened their windows and watched as a pale green glow appeared over the horizon. It seemed that even the living were drawn to this, compelled to watch by a spiritual feeling only the very old understood. Marlene stared, her eyes wide.
It's coming,
she said, as the green glow grew brighter. As Marlene watched, more tendrils rose up out of the ground between Com and Midgar. They rose up tall, intertwining, heading eastward toward the city. A glow then fell over her and the young girl looked up to see even more tendrils passing by overhead. They joined with the rest of the swarm. The life stream approached Midgar. The first of the tendrils reached Holy and touched its shimmering edge. The life stream and Holy merged together, becoming one. More tendrils followed it, and more still rose up and over before delving down into Holy. The power and will of the life stream poured into Holy, giving it strength that came from the planet itself. Holy's shield strengthened and Meteor's descent slowed almost to a complete stop. It pushed against Holy, trying to force its way through. The life stream swarmed over the city, 10,000 tendrils strong and more gathering around the two great magics. The tendrils rose up and moved over Holy, collecting around Meteor. They began to spread up Meteor's surface, covering it and keeping it at bay. Waves of energy began to pulse from Holy as the planet poured more of its life energy into it, fighting to the very last. Finally, one of the two forces gave way. A bright white light burst into the sky and swept across the land, drowning everything in a blinding light. The companions closed their eyes, unable to watch, and Marlene shielded her own eyes with her hand. The light grew brighter and brighter, until both Meteor and Holy vanished from their sight, drawn in by the unyielding light. As the light began to fade, returning to the endless darkness, Cloud thought he saw Eris standing amongst the shadows, her face bathed in sparkles of light. Her eyes were closed, her head lowered, as though in prayer. As he watched her, Eris opened her eyes and raised her head. She smiled. End of chapter. Episode 47, Epilogue, 500 years later. Epilogue, 500 years later. 500 years had passed since that fateful day in Midgar. The wounds of the planet were slowly beginning to heal, but it would be a long time before the planet forgot the trauma that it had suffered that day when Meteor nearly hit. The planet was not the only one that remembered that day. Nanaki, the last of the heroes of what history called the Genova War, still lived to this day. Nanaki was now over 500 years old, which equated to around 166 in human terms, but the Hound was not one to brag about his age. He had more battle scars now, and the 13 tattoo that had been branded onto his shoulder was worn and faded with age. His mane was thicker and his body was more well-built, more muscled. His large paws churned up the dirt as he ran down a path nestled between two tall, rocky cliffs. Nanaki glanced over his shoulder. Running behind him were his two children. Though only 30 and 24 years old between them, which was around 10 and 8 years, if you really wanted to know, both children already showed the signs of becoming strong defenders, like their father and grandfather before them. Nanaki turned his attention back to the path. It came to a dead end just up ahead, ending in a tall cliff wall, but that did not stop him. Without even breaking his pace, the hound leaped up onto a ledge jutting out of the rock. He leaped again, and in just 3 bounds he had reached the top of the wall. The hound padded slowly across it and stopped at the edge. His two children reached the top just seconds after, having to take a few more bounds than their father due to their smaller bodies. The two cubs came to stand beside their father, and together they looked out at the land beyond the cliffs. The ruins of Midgar lay just ahead. Nestled in the middle of a vibrant and beautiful valley, the ruins were barely visible amongst the luscious wildlife that had grown over it through the centuries. The dry and withered land was gone, replaced by fields greener than Nanaki had ever seen in his long years of life. The Shinra building, once a tower of terror and corruption, was now nothing more than a nesting place for the birds and creatures that roamed the land. Even the monsters had dwindled, in time, making this place one of the most treasured and beautiful places on the planet. Nanaki looked down at his children as they stood beside him, their eyes watching over the land that they would protect when finally the time came for Nanaki to return to the life stream. Perhaps one day the cubs too would become embroiled in a struggle for the life of the planet they had been born to protect. And Nanaki Red XII would be there to guide them, whether in life or in death. One day the planet's time would come, but that was a day that was far in the distant future. This was today, and the planet was alive. The end. A note from the authoress. And so it is that we finally reach the end of this long journey. It has been a very long road, and to be honest, after my first major hiatus back in 2006/7, I didn't think I would ever come back to it. It was on the June 22, 2004 that I uploaded the very first chapter of the first installment, and it is on this day, September 21, 2010, that I finally finish it. Whenever I tell people that I had been working on this for 6 years, they were amazed at how long I've stuck at it. The reason for that is simple. During the first installment I got a review from someone saying they really hoped that I would finish it, because they had seen too many people attempt to novelize the story and then give up partway through. I really did not want to be one of those people, so I made a solemn promise that I would see this story through to the end. And I've made good on that promise. Even though many of my original readers have moved on, I've gained more readers, and some in countries I never expected to see reading it, from America and England, where I hail from, to even Korea. I cherish every reader who takes the time to read my work. You have all been so kind and so patient, and I have truly enjoyed writing this. I even achieved my target of finishing it before I went on holiday to Florida, so I get an even deeper sense of pride that I was able to give you a specific deadline by which I would finish it, and I have literally just made it. I know Crisis Core was winning in my poll, but as yet I still have not finished taking down the script for it. As such, I will be moving away from Final Fantasy VII and moving on to Final Fantasy VIII. It was a race between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XIII over which would come next, but Final Fantasy VIII has been tugging at my heartstrings for a while, so I will work on that one next, and I also haven't finished script taking for FF13. I have not forgotten about Crisis Core, and I am still taking down the script. I will work on Final Fantasy VIII, but once I complete the script for Crisis Core I will commence work on that as well, and try to do both stories at the same time, since I know people wanted to see that written up. I should also say that after I come back off my holiday I am going to print off a couple of sample chapters and send them off to the Square Enix offices in London. I hold no hope that they'd want to publish it, but after spending 6 years on this the least I can do is try. So I guess I'll sign off here. There will be no more updates in this installment from me. I really hope you all enjoyed my story. Thank you to you all. Emerald Princess of Vernia. End of book. This is a random audiobook appeared, signing off.